All right. Well, welcome to the Joint Agriculture, State and Public Lands and Water Resources Committee. We're glad to be with you here today. With that, we'll have our staff call the roll and then we'll proceed from there.
Morning, Madam Chairman. This is roll call for September 11th, 2023. Senator French.
Here.
Senator Hicks.
Here.
Senator Ide.
Here.
Senator Kolb.
We hear he'll be delayed, so if you could watch for him and mark him present when he gets here.
Senator Larson.
Here.
Representative Allemand.
Present.
Representative Allred.
Here.
Representative Banks.
Here.
Representative Conrad.
Here.
Representative Davis.
Here.
Representative Slagle.
Present.
Representative Eklund.
Excused.
Excused.
Representative Winter.
Here.
Co-Chairman Steinmetz.
Here.
Co-Chairman Crago.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you, Katie. All right. All right. We have our computers ready to go. Well, welcome committee. It's nice to be in Pinedale and Sublette County. And I think Speaker Summers is here. Good morning and welcome. We recognize you. Do you have any remarks to welcome us to your county this morning?
Well, I appreciate you all coming and take a look at the beautiful scenery and all the agriculture going on here.
Thank you. So we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance, and then my dad, who's been kind enough to help me drive up here because I've been under the weather, I've asked him to pray for us today on this 9/11 remembrance. So first of all, Representative Crago, would you like to lead us in the pledge? Well, it's good to be with you here on the 22nd commemoration of 9/11. I'm sure we all remember where we were when that happened, and looking across the room, I think we're all old enough to remember that. And it was quite a somber day. And those of you who served or were called up into service after that, we'd like to recognize you. Would you please stand? Thank you so much. Thank you for your service. And as we remember that day today, I choose to remember the good things that came out of that and how united our nation was after that. And so I hope that as we go forward, you know, these policy discussions, we can
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Madam Co-Chairman, members of the committee. Brian Nesvik, Director of the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. I'm joined here today by, to my left, our Chief Game Warden, Rick King, and to my right, I think most of you are familiar with Deputy Chief Game Warden, Craig Smith. We also have with us today the President of our commission, Ralph Brokaw, and also our Commissioner from this district here, Ken Roberts. They're right behind me here to my right shoulder. So, Madam Co-Chair, Mr. Chairman, I do think I feel honored to be able to say a few words about what this day means to a lot of our Wyoming citizens. You know, as I listen to the news coverage, as I do every year on 9/11 in the morning, this morning, kind of a reenactment of, or actually not a reenactment, but a recitation of the events that happened that morning. You know, I became very angry, and I think that's the reaction that a lot of Americans have when they relive those days, or that day 22 years ago. But you know, there was it made a lot of changes in the way that we did business in America. It did. The good was it brought people together, as the good co-chairman pointed out. And you know, personally, it had significant changes for me as well. Consequential to that day, I found myself on leading great Wyoming soldiers on 2 combat tours to Iraq. And one of the other good things that came from that day and the corresponding changes that happened in our country and the war on terrorism was that many of our young Wyoming service members had the opportunity to shine and really show what Wyoming's all about. Everywhere we went, everything we did, you should all be very proud of the way that Wyoming soldiers served abroad. Incredible reflection on Wyoming values, incredible reflection on the American spirit, and an incredible reflection on why we are the greatest country in the world. So again, I thank you for the opportunity to share a few words about that here this morning. Getting into the meat of our first topic here this morning, you know, we certainly heard a lot of the public comment as well as some of the questions and concerns from this committee at the last meeting. I regret not being able to be there. We had a conflict with a commission meeting, and but you know, Deputy Chief Smith did a good job of answering questions, presenting information regarding our efforts on elk management, both currently and in the past. Today, I've asked our Chief Game Warden, Rick King, to give an update and some responses to some of the issues that were brought up at the last meeting, talk a little bit about what we're doing now with regards to elk management, what we have planned here in the very near future within a few months, and then also to provide specifics on our thoughts on this bill. We have been working closely with Mr. McGagnon and others to massage this bill and come up with changes that are agreeable. And then we will close with a very brief update on brucellosis and specific to wildlife and the efforts that the department takes on. A lot of it, right, we're kind of in the epicenter right here in Pinedale with a lot of the efforts that we engage in on an annual basis with regards to brucellosis. That will be brief, but I felt like it would be appropriate because of the next item on your agenda. So with that, Mr. Chairman, we will proceed unless anybody has any questions before we do that.
Questions from the committee? Please go forward.
Okay, Chief King.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Madam Co-Chair and members of the committee. My name is Rick King. I'm Chief Game Warden with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. And I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you this morning about our elk management challenges and the steps we're taking to address those. What I'd like to do is give you a brief overview of our elk management program and the strategies that we use to achieve our elk management goals, and then talk specifically about some of those herds that you all have heard the most from your constituents about. And then lastly, I'll wrap up with an overview of our damage claim process and summary, the damage program that we use to compensate landowners when all other methods have failed. So with that, I'll jump right into elk management. So the Game and Fish Department, through the commission's actions, manages 34 elk herds across the state. Each one of those elk herds has a management objective. That's kind of the goal that we're trying to manage towards. And in order to get to those goals, we use different harvest strategies. Those strategies are the methods that we use to achieve the overall objectives for the herd. I'd like to talk briefly about those objectives that we set for each of the elk herds. Each elk herd will have one of three objectives. The first objective that we use is a population objective. That's where we go out and collect as much data as we possibly can. We use some modeling to derive a population estimate. And then we've set a commission approved goal for that population. That's our preferred method to manage elk herds, is through a population objective. It's labor intensive. It takes a lot of effort to collect enough data to have a good solid population estimate, but it is the best way for us to manage, or the best objective that we have. The next objective that we use is a midwinter trend count. So it's similar in that we survey winter ranges and determine how many elk are on those winter ranges from year to year. It's not a true population estimate, but it does provide us a trend and allows us to see if a population is growing or stabilizing or decreasing. So that's a midwinter trend count. And then lastly, we have a landowner and sportsman satisfaction objective. This one, to be very frank, has been the most troubling for us and the most problematic. We simply survey landowners and sportsmen and ask them what their satisfaction is with the number of elk that are on the landscape. Our goal is to ensure that 60% of landowners and 60% of sportsmen or more are satisfied with the number of elk that are on the landscape in that herd. As you can imagine, that is problematic for us to use that objective, and we are in the process of moving away from that and replacing it with a different objective. We'd really like to move towards having a population.
As I mentioned, in order to achieve those objectives, we use different harvest strategies. The first is hunting seasons. That's the one that everybody's most familiar with. Annually, the commission will review our hunting seasons and set hunting seasons that we use to move that population towards our objective. In terms of elk, in the last several years, we have implemented long liberal seasons and have tried to maintain sufficient number of licenses out there in our herds to manage towards objective. We also have utilized our Access Yes program extensively. Our Access Yes program is a really flexible program that allows us to work with landowners and target specific properties to help us achieve elk harvest in those places, especially where we're objective.
That Access Yes program has a couple of different components. Many of those you're probably familiar with: our walk-in program, our hunter management area program. But we also have a component in there that's what we call our HMAP or our Hunter Management and Assistance Program, where we've actually hired Game and Fish Department employees to go work with individual landowners and really create a custom program for those landowners, where our employees work closely with sportsmen, basically hold their hand, ensure that they follow the rules of the ranch that they're hunting on. And we really oversee that elk harvest to try to take as much burden off the landowner as possible through that HMAP program. That's been very successful. We've used it in a lot of places. We've used it in Laramie Peak and Iron Mountain and in the Black Hills. A third component of our harvest strategy has been something that we've just implemented recently. For a long time, we had depredation seasons, and some of you may be familiar with those. About 2 years ago, the commission directed us to rework that depredation season and bring those regulations, modernize them, make them more useful for the department. So we did a rewrite of those depredation seasons. That's within our commission regulations, chapter 34. We call those our auxiliary management seasons. And really has proven to be a very effective tool. We can use those auxiliary management seasons as a supplement to the regular hunting seasons and really provide some pinpoint surgical opportunity to harvest elk in problem areas. It's a very flexible program. Last year was really the first implementation of that new opportunity for us. But already this year, we're implementing it in several places, and I'll talk some more details in just a minute about that. Lastly, we do have the ability through statute and through commission regulation to implement lethal take permits. So those are permits that are authorized by the district commissioner and the chief game warden to lethally remove elk, and those can either be issued to department employees or even into private individuals. We have used that tool quite extensively and look to use that tool more often here in the near future. I would like to jump into a couple of our herds where we know we've heard the most and are the most contentious. So, for example, in the Black Hills, I mentioned our HMAP program. We're continuing to use that HMAP program in the Black Hills. It's been highly successful in the past, and I know we'll continue to have a great deal of success there. We're also using those auxiliary management seasons in the Black Hills currently. Just this summer, we authorized a number of auxiliary management permits. We currently have 100 permits that are out there that have been sold and are being put to use right now, in addition to the regular hunting seasons. In our Laramie Peak herd, we're again using auxiliary management seasons there. Those are currently underway, and again, we have just over 100 licenses that have already been issued and harvested those. Lastly, the Iron Mountain herd, which has garnered the most attention. Herd that's between Cheyenne and Laramie. That herd, as you have discussed previously, is well over objective. Our current population estimate for that herd is about 4,800 elk. Our objective is 1,800. So we have a long ways to go. And in order to get there, we need to achieve some significant antlerless elk harvest. So I wanted to talk briefly about the program that we've put in place for Iron Mountain. So in addition to our long liberal seasons where we have abundant licenses that are out there on the landscape for hunters to use, we've also stepped up our efforts. Last year, we used a pilot program where we actually hired 2 department employees and we issued a lethal take permit. Those 2 employees harvested 129 elk. It was very successful. It was a lot of work. Those guys are amazing. It's tough to find folks like that who can go out in February and March in that country and harvest elk. They're tough, very tough folks. That pilot program, though, is effective, and we're looking to double our efforts this year with that similar program, and we're looking to hire a second crew. So we'll have 2 crews doing that work again this late winter, early spring under that Chapter 56 permit. In addition to that, our Laramie region has been in contact with a number of landowners in that area, and we are in the process currently of issuing lethal take permits to individual landowners. So the way those will be structured, and we'll get those approved this week, the lethal take permit will be issued to an individual landowner for 15 to 20 elk at a time. The landowner or any of his designees can take elk under that permit, just following basic hunting regulations. It'll all be daytime work. They'll have to retrieve the carcasses. We'll issue tags that they can put on those animals. But I'm really excited about that. That's a major step in the right direction for us to achieve significant harvest in that Iron Mountain herd using the lethal take permits. I think before I jump into our damage program, are there any questions so far?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Why are some of these herds, probably not all of them, but you're talking about Iron Mountain, it was I think you said the objective was 1,800 and there's 4,800 or whatever. Why is it allowed to get that far? And then you get into a crisis situation. It's like, oh my God, we got to issue lethal take, or we got to have our game wardens out there shooting 50 or whatever. You know, after a hunting season and maybe the next year you look at it, it's 1,900 or 2,000. And the next year, you know, it's slowly growing. Shouldn't the Game and Fish at that point say, oh, this thing's starting to, we see the trend here. This is going to get out of hand. It seems like wait until it is out of hand and then, oh my word, what can we do here? Issue lethal take and all that, because essentially you're 3,000 head more than your original objective. So it's been over a number of years, and I don't know how many years, but it's been getting out of hand. Can you comment on that? Thank you.
Chief King.
Mr. Chairman, Senator French, thank you. So just to back up a little bit, that Iron Mountain herd is a herd that we've long known that it's highly productive. There really are no predators down there to speak of. There's no wolves or grizzly bears. It's a very productive herd. It's 90% private land, has high reproductive rates, and we've known that herd can grow rapidly for a long time. And so for 15 years, we've been working to try to address that population. So clear back in 2012, for example, we created a hunter management and assistance program there. We hired 2 department employees and worked with some individual ranches to get hunter access there. That first year of that program was highly successful. We harvested almost 300 antlerless elk in that program. Really was a good step in the right direction. Unfortunately, we had a landowner, one of the major players in that, decided they didn't want to be in that program. The elk that were there were okay to them, basically. The next year, that program was far less successful. So this is a place we've been working for a long time to try to address elk numbers, but it is tricky because there are places where landowners really would like to help reduce elk numbers, and then there's other places where we just don't have the ability to infringe on anybody's private property rights. And if they choose not to allow access or they're not as concerned about elk numbers as their neighbors, it puts us in a tough spot. So it's a place we've worked on hard for about 15 years. And I think these tools that we're putting in place now just recently represent us continually trying to put the most effective tools onto the landscape. So we've been working at it hard for a while. We've got a long ways to go, but does that answer your question?
Mr. Co-Chair. Yeah, that helps. I know it's tough and it's up in our country too, that some landowners love to see them. They're kind of, well, yeah, they love to see the elk more than the cow, I guess. Ever introducing elk if there's not elk there, you know what I mean? Because you can see there's going to be a problem in the future. But yeah, thank you.
Any response to that, Chief King?
Mr. Chairman, I think that's probably a good lead in to the next topic I wanted to address, which is our damage compensation program. So in those areas where
Chief King, I'm just going to stop you for a second. I think we had a few more questions before we get into that. I think Senator Hicks had raised his hand, and I have a couple reps on the other end down here as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we'll get into it maybe a little more when we start talking about the bill draft, but if you could just expand a little bit on the discussion of what constitutes objective, because I know the department puts a number out there, but it's usually a range. And if you could just provide a little more edification for the committee of how you view objective numbers relative to a range versus a hard and fast number, and particularly when you make a determination of whether a herd's at objective or not. So the point being is it might be a little over or a little under, but that'll be a critical component when we get into the bill is what constitutes being at objective. So if you could just speak a little bit on that, please.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, thanks for that question. So as I mentioned, when we try to estimate an elk population, it's impossible really to come up with a total count and be extremely precise about the number of elk on the landscape. So we do the best job we can to estimate a population. Usually those estimates have a range. We have some assurance that that elk population is within a range plus or minus our estimate. And so when we set an objective, we know that we don't have the ability to say precisely we're at that exact number or not. And so we use the a 20% plus or minus range. So as long as our estimate is within plus or minus 20% of our objective, then the herd is considered at objective. And again, that's just because of the variability in coming up with a precise estimate.
Mr. Chairman, that's going to be very important when we get into the discussion on the bill draft where it says objective. And so I think we need to make that cleaning objective. So that'll be an important component of that discussion. Thank you for that clarification.
And Chief, maybe when we get to the bill draft, you can address that specifically on the actual language and how you perceive that working. That would be helpful when we get to that point, I think. Representative Banks.
Chairman, my question is in regards to the control methods here. So the auxiliary management, you mentioned kind of took the place of the depredation. And if I recall, the depredation, if I had a bunch of deer in my alfalfa, I could go and apply for depredation and be able to take care of that problem. Are we going to replace that? Now, is the lethal take permits going to take the place of that? Or is the lethal take permits just kind of if their objective is way over the number, we can go get a lethal take permit and go about it that way? Or is depredation also going to be kind of still involved in the process? Or is there other things in that auxiliary management that's going to kind of take the place of depredation?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Banks, so that's a good question. I view these tools as all options that are on the table, and there may be some places where the auxiliary management season will work better than a lethal take permit and vice versa. I think the auxiliary management seasons are a really good option for us to be very surgical about putting licenses in a place where we have issues and trouble. But those lethal take permits, again, they're basically the heavy artillery, and so in those places where we have the most trouble, where we're well over objective, and it's across a broad area like Iron Mountain, and we have willing landowners, I think that's probably the best tool. So to answer your question, it's nice to have that suite of tools that we can pick the best one for the particular situation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just out of curiosity, I haven't had to go through the process in a while. As a private landowner, am I allowed to go and apply and I guess it's called it the auxiliary management season. Is there still the thing as a depredation tag that I can go apply for that? Where I can go remove a couple of deer from my property?
Mr. Chairman, we utilized a lot of depredation seasons. And in the past, in the process that was outlined in reg, we would have people apply if they were interested, and then we'd maintain a list of folks and we'd call if we ended up with places where we had depredation problems and we're going to implement a depredation season. In that rewrite of the auxiliary management chapter, we took a lot of that out and increased the flexibility for us to put something in place right away. So now it'll be an auxiliary management season. So as a landowner, if you have trouble or you have several landowners together that have an issue, we can quickly go in there, write up a hunt area boundary description, set the dates, determine the number of licenses, and then have landowners let folks know about it, and then they can determine who they want on their property to utilize those auxiliary management seasons.
Oh, man.
Thank you for being here. How many permits are sold in Area 7? I understand that is the Iron Mountain. Not how many are offered, but how many permits are sold in that area?
Chief.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Allemand, I'll have to do some digging. We sell essentially all the licenses that are issued in the regular hunting season. I think we might have had a handful of antlerless tags that were available in the leftover draw this year. Let me double check for sure, but I think those have all been issued.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My calculations, and I know they're not 100% right, but it shows that we're having almost 1,700 calves born a year. Is that somewhat close? And can we hunt our way out of 1,700 a year added on when we're already way over our objective?
Chief. Mr. Chairman, Representative Allemand. So I don't have the exact numbers for Laramie Peak with me, but we can dig into those. So in Laramie Peak, for example, our objective is 5,000 elk, and we're about 2.5 times above that. Our challenge there is that there are places that very large ranches that can harbor 5,000 elk just between 2 or 3 ranches. And so as we work to harvest elk, we're going to be in a tough spot to get to objective lethal take permits. We can get that herd towards an objective that's more acceptable to the majority of landowners that are out there that are experiencing difficulties.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How long is this going to take? Is it a 1-year plan to get to our objective, or is it 20? Because we've already been over our objective for many.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Allman, yeah, you bring up a good point. We can't get there overnight. Again, many of these issues are going to take some time for us to continue to work on and continue to throw these different tools out there and try different techniques and approaches, and we can't do it overnight. So for example, in the Iron Mountain herd, we have challenged our folks to come up with a 5-year plan. So we've identified how many cow elk would have to be harvested each year over 5 years to get to our objective. And that's that aggressive plan that we're putting into place right now for Iron Mountain. So in brief, no, we can't get there in a year. It does take several years, and it takes us continuing to be flexible and trying different things each year in order to achieve that cow elk harvest that we need to.
Senator.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
First, I'd like to know broadly across the state of Wyoming, how many other areas are this kind of condition? Are you aware of more of them? What do we actually do with in total? I'm concerned. And the second one is more of just a comment. You folks are the ones that are close. This is your job, not my job to tell you what to do with micromanage it. So I look forward to hearing more about what we can do so we don't find ourselves in this mess again that we're now trying to deal with. Thank you.
Chief.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, thank you. So I mentioned that we have 34 elk herds in the state. Currently, 12 of those are over objective. The majority of those are in the eastern side of the state. The Black Hills, Laramie Peak, Iron Mountain, those are the ones that are significantly over objective, but 12 of our 34 elk herds are currently over objective.
Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How much, not being familiar with the movement of these elk, but migration, do these elk migrate into this area in the winter or during hunting season? Do they disperse in the summer, or what does that play in there?
Chief.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, that's a good question. And so in different parts of the state, elk exhibit different strategies. So some elk are migratory. They spend their summers in the high country, migrate to lower elevations for the winter. In most of eastern Wyoming, though, that's not the case. In most places in eastern Wyoming, our elk are on the landscape, kind of scattered. They utilize a lot of that landscape year round. They may make some minor adjustments elevation wise when the snow gets too deep. But if you look at Laramie Peak, Iron Mountain, those herds mostly just stay in the general area, maybe making some elevation movements as snow gets deeper. We do have some challenges though. And if you look at certain herds that border other states, we see places where that migratory action throws another wrench into our ability to manage elk. I'll take the Uinta herd, for example, south of Mountain View and Evanston. That herd, many of them spend the summer in Utah, where Utah would like to grow more elk. And then as the snow flies, they move north into Wyoming and create trouble for our landowners. So down there, we have a very liberal harvest program that's the exact opposite of what our neighboring state is doing for that herd. The Black Hills is another good example where we do have some movement of elk across the state line. It's not necessarily seasonal, but elk are moving across. And we have South Dakota again that would like to grow elk. That's their premier elk hunting spot in the Black Hills. And we're trying to manage for a lower density of elk. So some of that movement does create an added wrinkle to things for us.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to add one other thing. It's a great question. So the other phenomenon we see is that elk that otherwise may not move consequential to hunting pressure. And so they know where those places are at, where they can go, and they're not going to be hunted and where they don't see people. And in a lot of these areas where we've seen expanded elk populations, 20 years ago, we didn't have very many elk. Black Hills is a great example. It was a coveted license to be able to draw. And, you'd have smaller landowners that would think elk were kind of a novelty and they'd like having them around. And then the herd grew and grew and grew. They learned to move to those places where they weren't going to get hunted during the hunting season. And it allowed for, a lot of these populations to grow faster than they otherwise would have. We don't typically have, there's some limited exceptions, but it's not common that we have over objective elk herds on public lands where we have access, where we have the ability to harvest elk.
Senator Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you repeat the permit process? And so we can, I wasn't listening very well.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Larson. So our lethal take permits are authorized through statute and then commission regulation. And that process is fairly straightforward. So as chief game warden, I can issue those lethal take permits with the approval of the district game and fish commissioner. And we have a lot of flexibility there. We can issue those permits to department employees to do that lethal take, or we can actually issue those to individuals. So in the case of our Iron Mountain herd, we're in the process right now of issuing those lethal take permits directly to landowners. So that permit will be issued. It'll have some stipulations that they have to follow as a condition of the permit. But those permits are free. There's no cost, and they will be issued in an individual landowner's name, but he can it'll also authorize any of his designees. So that particular landowner, if they want to do the lethal take themselves, they can. If they have friends or family members that are effective, that they want to utilize that lethal take permit, they'll have that ability.
Follow up?
Yes, thank you. How does the herd react to that? Do they sometimes head the heck out of there?
Chief? Mr. Chairman, Senator Larson, yeah, that's a great question. And as Director Nesbitt mentioned, elk are extremely smart. They figure out where hunting pressure is and where it isn't, and they like to move to where it isn't. I think in the case of these places where we're having a lot of challenges like Iron Mountain, the more hunters and the more opportunity for take that we have across the landscape over as long a period as time as possible, will keep those elk guessing and keep them on the move. And that'll help tremendously with our harvest objectives.
Senator French.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I'll get this mic right yet, maybe. Is there anything, I'll just use myself as an example, that north of Cody, we call them the herd that comes into our farms, our places every night. We call them night raiders. And we rarely see them, but we see the effects, their tracks, their trails, where they've ate on our hay fields or sandfoin. They love sandfoin, kind of sweet, I guess, but they'll travel 6 to 8 miles every night to our fields. And then before daylight, they're clear back 6 to 8 miles in the rougher country and neighboring ranches and stuff. Is there, if I was got a lethal take or any of these permits, I wouldn't be able to accomplish anything because I wouldn't see them. So can you address the night raiders that are hitting me every night? The other night there was well over 200, 250 probably. You'll hear them out there chirping. Now they're starting to do a little bit of bugling, but can you comment on that, please? Thank you.
Chief. Mr. Chairman, Senator French. So our department in the past has utilized lethal take permits where our department employees have actually gone and done lethal removal at night. And if we have a willing landowner with a situation like you described, we'd certainly be willing to implement lethal take permit and do that activity at night. It takes a lot of thought and planning and preparation so we can do it safely. But there are situations across the state where we've implemented that tool for hunting at night.
Follow up.
Yeah. So if I wanted to pursue that, or my neighbors, I'm not the only one, or any of us want to pursue that, who do we contact? Local game warden or our Cody supervisor, or how do we pursue that and say, geez, could you please take out 25, 50 of these things? Could you help us somehow? Because we never see them. I mean, rarely, major snowstorm. Sometimes they'll linger in the field before they head back, and we'll see them, but very rare. Thank you.
Chief. Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator French. Yes, I'd recommend the first call is to your local game warden, but Regional Wildlife Supervisor Dan Smith and Cody would also be a great first contact.
Senator Ide.
Mr. Chairman, just a quick question. On these 34 areas that you guys manage, how much input or influence do the landowners have on the numbers that you guys come up with on those herds? Thank you.
Chief. Mr. Chairman, Senator, that's a great question. Thank you. So when we set an objective, we evaluate what the biological reality for that herd is. And that can be quite a range. And then from there, we seek public input, and that input, our local guys, when they go talk to folks, they reach out to landowners and members of the public to get input and help further refine that objective, that then we take that recommendation forward to the commission for their approval. So through those processes and in those herds where they're predominantly private landowners play a huge role in helping us set those objectives.
Follow up.
That helps a lot. Just to follow up real quick. So if you had an area that was predominantly private land, and say it was just a handful of landowners, a half a dozen that controlled that whole area, and they recommended 0, what would you guys say to that?
Chief. Mr. Chairman, Senator I'm trying to think. We have some areas. So for example, Elk Area 129 is kind of a large expansive country north of Douglas, where our goal is really to have as few elk as possible out there. Our objective isn't 0 in that particular case. Are we using that landowner sportsman satisfaction objective, and landowners are more satisfied the fewer elk that are out there. So we don't have a place where the objective is 0, but we do have quite a few places where the objective is as few as possible.
I got a couple of questions for you myself, Chief. You talked about the 12 areas that are over objective. And, last meeting, we spent a great deal of time on the Iron Mountain herd, and we heard, how much more over objective it was. The other 11 that are over objective, do they have the similar type percentage over objective, or are they just a few over objective? Kind of what's the layout of the land, so to speak, of those other 11 that are over objective, just so we have more of a idea as we're working on this for a statewide basis instead of just Iron Mountain.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, that's a good question. And I do have a brief summary that I've put together, and I'd like to go ahead and I'll just email it to all the committee members so that you have it. I should have sent that ahead of time, but I felt like the damage report I gave you was probably too much. So let me send that to you. It has a map overview, shows what our objectives are for the herd and where they're at in relation to our objective, and then has a more detailed explanation for each of the herd units. So I'll email that to you. In brief, though, there's probably 4 or 5 herds that are well above objective, a few that are just barely above objective, and then a couple that are just problematic. And those are mainly the ones where we have that landowner sportsman satisfaction, where it's just tough. We don't have a good population estimate, but we know landowners are dissatisfied with the number of elk that are out there.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions on this topic? Co-Chairman Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one question for you guys, and that is, I'm sure this isn't the first time this has happened. I'm sure that you've dealt with situations like this before. Could you give us an example of a situation like this you've dealt with, and what has been your successful solution to the problems? And is there something similar? And then obviously you put these management techniques into practice. So if you could just give us a track record on that briefly.
Chief. Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Madam Co-Chair. So, it's always kind of a moving target. There's new challenges that pop up here and there that we try to address. I might go back to our example of the Uinta elk herd. That's a place where we have conflicting desires of different states. Utah would like to see more elk. We would like to see less. Over the years, we've adapted our harvest strategies to ensure that as those elk move out of the Uintas, we have a season in place that can address damage. I think we've done a pretty good job down there in adjusting our seasons annually to make sure that we're not running too many elk down there and that we're minimizing damage. But I think this is an important place to make a couple of points. And one is that we do have a damage compensation program, and we also have other mitigation techniques that we put in place. So for example, across the state for decades, we have provided fencing materials to landowners to help fence stored crops, stored hay. So for example, in Uinta County for decades, we've distributed that fencing materials so that producers down there can provide elk-proof fences for their stored hay. In cases where we can't mitigate damage and we can't fence elk out of haystacks and they just cause damage, then our damage compensation program comes into place. And that's where we pay landowners for damage caused by big game animals. That's a pretty extensive program, and I can talk a little bit more about that in brief. But I think one place where we've shown some good success is in that Cody country. Between Matitsi and Cody, we've had elk numbers there that really were much higher than we preferred. We used our HMAP program between a hunter management area and hiring a technician to help basically hold the hand of hunters. We were able to, in a couple of years, address a specific problem up there where a couple of years of heavy elk harvest redistributed those elk, brought numbers down, moved them off the problem areas, and it's pretty effective. So again, I think we've seen the most success where we have used all the tools in the toolbox, and we've been able to do that over a number of years, and we've had the support and coordination and cooperation of both sportsmen and landowners. And when we have all that, I think we can make significant headway.
And I think this is a great question to talk specifically about Iron Mountain. When we applied the techniques that Chief King's talking about back in 2012, we made a significant difference, and a significant amount of the pressure from landowners was curtailed after that significant harvest. And in fact, the complaint that we received from the landowners that are now not wanting to participate anymore is that we killed too many elk. And really, we didn't hear a lot of complaints for a few years. And when we went back and said, okay, it's time to do this again, we need to apply that kind of pressure again and kill a lot of elk in 1 year again. Two key landowners were not in, and that was very problematic. And that's, I think, an example of where we had some success, but then without continued participation, now we're back in the same boat again, that we're here talking about things that we've never really done in Wyoming with the auxiliary hunts that Chief King's talked about, and a really liberal lethal take permit program. So there's a way to do it, but it does require on a large scale, quite a bit of cooperation from a lot of folks, and some of them don't necessarily want to see a reduction in the elk herd.
If we can move on to the next topic, I would mention before we get into the bill draft, it's whenever we get to that portion of your presentation, we'll probably jump in and have LSO give us a briefing on the actual bill draft, and then we'll continue and keep you gentlemen up there for the questioning. Thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman, I would just like to cover our damage program in brief, and then I'll stop there and we can move on to the bill draft. So our damage program is unlike any other state. A lot of states don't have a damage compensation program, or it's not as extensive as the Wyoming Game and Fish Department's program. So clear back in 1939, the legislature recognized how important private land is to the state's wildlife. And they devised a way to ensure some continued support for wildlife because of that critical importance of private land in Wyoming. So that back in 1939, the legislature directed the commission to establish a damage compensation program. it's been modified and adjusted over the years to what we currently have. But currently we receive about 150 to 200 damage claims per year. The vast majority of those claims are paid and paid in full. We usually only have a small number each year that are contested, and a very small number that are not paid in full. That damage compensation program, annually, the department spends about Thanks. So annually, the department's damage program costs about $3 million. About half of that is our personnel time and purchasing of materials for stack yards, like I mentioned earlier. And then about half that is direct damage compensation payments. So in fiscal year 22, the damage summary that you all received, we paid about $1.5 million in damage claims. And in that particular year, about 25 to 30% of those claim or that amount of money was spent on elk damage, and the other big chunk was grizzly bears. So between elk and grizzly bears, that eats up a huge chunk of that damage payment, at least in fiscal year 22. And that's kind of been a trend that we've seen, is elk and grizzly bears are the leading cause of damage right now, and that's what we're paying the most for in terms of damage. The process is pretty straightforward. If you're a landowner and you're suffering damage from big game or trophy game animals, the first step is to reach out to the district game warden or your district commissioner and report the damage. And from there, our department moves into action. We try to mitigate the damage as best we can. We'll use hazing techniques, lethal removal, whatever we think we can use to try to mitigate the damage. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of places where we just can't mitigate it, and we pay the damage claim. So once the damage is over, the landowner submits a claim. Our folks will investigate that and make their recommendation, and then those claims are paid. So as you get into the bill discussion today, I just would again reiterate that our program has been around for a long time. It has seen some adjustments here and there, but by and large, it's been a very successful program, and the majority of the claims that we receive are paid in full. I'd stop there for any questions that you might have.
Any questions from the committee at this point? And I will say, after we have LSO address the bill draft, we can come back with questions for the gentleman regarding the bill draft, which might be the quickest way to do this. All right, if we could get one of our good staff attorneys to fill us in on the bill draft. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the committee. This bill draft is entitled 24 LSO 114 Excess Wildlife Population Damage Amendments. On page 2, this bill draft strikes extraordinary damage to grass and replaces it with damage to non-irrigated rangelands. And then the new subsection J begins on page 4. Subject to subsection C, which states, subject to subsection C of the section, in any established herd unit where the population of big game species exceeds the population established by the commission for 2 or more consecutive years, a landowner, lessee, or agent may report damage due to lost forage and submit a verified claim for damages within 60 days of the last item of damage being discovered. The landowner, lessee, or agent shall be entitled to damage for lost forage as follows. The Game and Fish Department is authorized to establish by rule, method, factors, and formulas to be used for determining the amount to compensate any landowner, lessee, or agent for lost forage due to a big game herd unit exceeding the population objective. The department is authorized to determine individualized harm suffered by a landowner or lessee. The landowner, lessee, or agent must permit hunting on their property during authorized hunting seasons. An additional proof of damage will be required to continue to be eligible for annual damage payments. The landowner, lessee, or agent will only be eligible to collect compensation for lost forage under B or J of this section. Then subsection 2 allows the Game and Fish Department to promulgate rules, and subsection 3 authorizes a split effective date. And I'd stand for any questions.
Any questions for Ms. Johnson? Thank you.
Thank you.
Committee, any questions for the director or the deputy director or the chief? Co-chairman Steinmetz.
All right, well, my question is, in this bill was presented to us the last committee meeting before I had had a chance to review the statutes. So I was just wondering what the difference would be under this bill as opposed to subsection C that is already in statute right now, and how the department administers the program that's currently in place.
Chief, Mr. Chairman, Madam Co-Chair. So I'll take the first crack at that, and then I'll have Craig jump in if he has anything to add. The biggest change in this draft that you're looking at is the way we would handle payments to extraordinary damage to grass or those non-irrigated rangelands. So as the statute currently reads, it does provide for the ability to pay for extraordinary damage to grass. And then in statute or in regulation, we define what that is. And it's use that it exceeds the customary or average use. So we don't typically pay very much in extraordinary damage to grass. So think of those, your dryland pasture type settings. Those claims we're not paying very many of those right now. This bill, the biggest change would be that it would essentially define damage more or less as any place where a herd is over objective for 2 or more years, then that would trigger a damage payment for that non-irrigated or that extraordinary damage to grass. That's the biggest change in there. The language that's in that current bill allows the commission and the department through rule and reg to fine tune that, which I think is important because it's pretty tough to figure out all the nuances, I think, in statute, and through rule and reg, we have a better ability to work through those nuances to where we can make it applicable and manageable for us. Craig, do you have anything to add?
Any more questions from the committee on the bill draft? Representative Slagle.
Chairman, question I would have is, as I look at this, it's the permissions given to the department to establish rules and methods for how you're going to compensate landowners. I don't see any area there for input from landowners how they would like to be compensated, and they're the ones that are receiving the damage. I think there should be some way for their input to be at least heard, because it's pretty easy to make regulations for somebody when you don't have any skin in their game, really. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Slagle. So through and applicable, and then we would take that out for public comment. And then after a public comment period, take that in front of the commission for their approval. And at that commission, so there'd be 2 places, actually 3 places where we would receive landowner input. One is in that initial development of a draft reg. The second would be when we officially put it out for public comment. And then the third would be when it goes in front of the commission for their final approval. So there's multiple places along the way that we can get that important input to make sure we get it right.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The follow-up would be, I guess, in dealing with not this issue, but in BLM issues, a lot of times BLM comes out, they're making changes to the regulations. Landowners don't have a clue that's happening. And finally, when the rule comes out, then the landowners realize something's come through. And so my question would be, do you, like, if you're doing a regulation that's basically going to cover a specific area or region, do you kind of contact all those private landowners and let them know? Because I mean, a lot of times, at least talking for myself, I'm busy enough doing my daily job that I don't sit there looking at all the places where these regulation type things come out and are noticed. And so I don't hear about it until we're way down the process. And so I guess that'd be my question. How well do you notify private landowners that how these regulations are being changed?
Chief, Mr. Chairman, so when we take out regulations for the commission's approval, we use a combination of email notices. We include in our emails out to everybody that new rules are out there for draft review. Our website has an opportunity for folks to review the draft rule and comment on it electronically, but we also take written comments. So, and then a lot of media places will pick up those announcements that we send out that a draft rule is out there for public comment. We can always do better. We'll welcome any help possible. I think in this particular case, I think Mr. McGagna is going to help us significantly make sure that the word is out there. But
just so I understand, and I'm sure you have examples of it, when you have a landowner that doesn't want to allow hunting, and you know, he's sort of beholden to the game and fish when he owns that ranch on the number of herd that they can have in that area. What is that landowner's recourse if he doesn't want to allow hunting? Is his only recourse, if I understand it right, is to get as many lethal take permits as he can get? Is that how that would work? Thank you.
Chief, Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide. So we'll work with landowners and like I mentioned, our Access Yes program, for example, very flexible. We'll do everything that we can to try to meet a landowner's needs through that program. But if that's not acceptable, there are options like the auxiliary management seasons or lethal take, to where we can really put the ball in the court of the landowner to determine who's going to be there, who's gonna hunt. You know, at that point, it's basically the ball's in the court of the landowner to determine who they want there and how they want that harvest to occur.
Representative Alaman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you give me a definition of ordinary damage to grass? What does that look like? How much damage do you have to have?
Chief, Representative Chairman, Representative Alaman. So in regulation, we currently define that as, let me get to it here. So we define extraordinary damage to grass as the loss or harm is proven by the landowner, lessee, or agent that significantly exceeds the usual, customary, or average use of non-cultivated grass plants. So what that would look like is if you're a landowner and over the past couple of years, you've had a dozen elk on your place. And then suddenly 100 elk show up one fall for whatever reason, that would trigger an extraordinary damage grass claim. So you'd notify the local game warden, we'd come out, we'd count the number of elk, and for extraordinary damage to grass claims, and Craig can correct me if I'm wrong, but we typically rely on counts.
On that issue, unless that herd was over objective for 2 years, that landowner would not be eligible for compensation under this bill. Under the scenario, so if the elk herd's at objective, you had a bunch of elk moved in for whatever reason and did whatever the definition for extraordinary loss, they would not be available for compensation under this program because this only pertains to elk units or big game units where it exceeds 20% of or exceeds objective for 2 years. Is that the way you read the bill draft? Because that's the way I would read the bill. And then the scenario you described, they would not be eligible.
Chief, so Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, so that's a good point. So under the current regulation, extraordinary damage to grass could be paid in the scenario I just described. So if a sudden spike in the number of elk on a landowner's place occurs, that would allow for payment. The second that we just put in about a year ago, we updated the regulation to include a drought component. So if there was a drought over the last 2 or 3 years, that could trigger a payment. So you may have the same number of elk you've had for quite a while, but because of drought, the impact is greater. So we're currently put in a provision for that drought situation. And then what I view this bill as being a third tier, which is an over objective elk herd would trigger that damage payment process. So there are some nuances in this bill that I'm not quite certain about. I think it's going to require some thoughtful work, and we're very willing to work with you all and Mr. Magagna and others to refine it. But I whatever happens, we don't want to lose the ability to pay for that situation I just described, which is the current extraordinary damage to grass or drought. I think the intent is just to add this third component.
Director.
Now, Mr. Chairman, as always, the chief was ahead of me. That's exactly what I wanted to point out. If that's, I didn't read it that way, but if we need to study that, because if that's what this bill does, we need to make whatever amendments are necessary, because we want to maintain the ability to do what we currently do already for herds that aren't over objective, to be able to compensate for extraordinary damage to grass, but also add this bill is intended to add this other component. So we need
program, and your statutes can't supersede if we pass this and then put it into statutes. And so it may actually limit your ability without going in and then authorizing another program that's below objective. And that's what I think we need to be careful and understand as we move forward with this, which I think there's a lot of work to be done on this bill draft yet. We're a long ways to go. But we need to look at that to make sure that we haven't all of a sudden created a scenario where we have isolated instances around the state of damage to rangelands that cannot be compensated. And under the current statutory framework of this bill, I don't see that's possible. So, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Any comment from the three of you? Senator Cole, please.
Mr. Chairman, just a general question about personnel needs. Do you see you need the department or your agency needing any more people to administer these new rules or claims, I should say, that you might encounter? What is your anticipated impact to what you normally do if, say, this has been worked and tweaked, that it becomes law. What are your thoughts on personnel needs? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Director.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, thank you for the question. So we do, in the past, the way we've handled additional workloads associated with damage is primarily through either putting that workload on our existing FTE permanent personnel, or we've hired additional contract employees. Our cap on contract employees is a lot easier to work through. We can increase the number of temporary employees on a short-term basis fairly easily. And that's what we've done in the past. When Chief King talked about hiring people to go administer some of these programs, that's what we've done. They're not permanent people. With your question's excellent, though, and that we have identified for a lot of other reasons, but this being one of the main ones, that we do have a need to increase our position cap. Our position cap is set by the governor. It's been in place for 20 years. 20 years this year, actually. And in that 20 years, we've had a lot of increase in responsibility, both from the legislature, public expectations. We've taken on programs that didn't exist back then. A couple of great examples is our large carnivore program. We didn't have nearly the number of grizzly bears and wolves then as we do now. We've been tasked with. So I have worked with the governor to evaluate increasing that position cap. Our plan is if that's approved, that we are going to allocate a significant number of positions to dealing with wildlife conflict, landowner relations, and access. And I do believe that we've made some good progress there, and I think that we're going to be able to address those personnel needs after this cap is increased.
Senator Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, so if we start out with the beginning of the bill, one of the things I've got a question for you guys is when we look at this, the way that the terminology is we're talking about objectives for herd units, but within a herd unit, you may have multiple hunting units within those. And so what we do with the aggregate population estimates on the herd unit. So what happens in the scenario where you have a number of hunting units that actually may be declining in populations, balance that with one that's over? So is this allow you the flexibility to go in and manage, then again, back to the compensation component? It's very easy in some cases to have a herd unit that's at objective, but a hunt unit may not be. And I'm thinking one similar, down in Carbon County with the checkerboard land, they're just south of Rollins, where the overall herd unit may be objective, but that hunting unit has exploded because of the private property and the access. Does this allow enough flexibility to address that issue, where it's all the same herd, but you have one herd unit, one hunting unit, where we have a lot of elk and another one that's probably close to objective? Is it limiting when we use the term herd unit versus hunting unit? Just a general question. Do you foresee, is that a potential issue?
Director.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, I believe that since the commission has the ability to determine herd unit boundaries, if that condition you just described did exist, the commission would have the ability to modify the herd unit in order to deal with the situation you described. One that comes to mind for me is we have one herd unit that's one hunt area where we have a significant challenge, and that's Laramie Peak. We department, if we actually did that, we haven't had success doing that, but when we've discussed, and it's very checkerboarded, as you described, you've got national forest mixed in with a lot of private land. When we've discussed the notion with landowners about changing the license structure to go from a limited quota to a general license structure, they are not supportive, and we've not moved that forward because of that. when we've suggested increasing the objective to be what's more realistic with what's on the ground, what's more realistic with both landowner and sportsman expectations, landowners have been very resistant to increasing the objective at all. And so we have not. I mean, kind of goes back to the point that I believe Representative Almond or Representative Schlegel brought up, about landowner, maybe it was Representative Banks, I don't remember, but how much landowner input is there into these objectives? It's significant in those areas where there's a lot of private land. So I think that's a good point, but I do believe we've got the flexibility under the current abilities, powers and duties of the commission to be able to change herd unit boundaries if necessary.
Thank you.
Any
Mr.
more?
Chairman, another question on the bill draft.
Yes, please.
So when we look at the bill draft, a lot of this, it seems like we're using multitude of different words for the same thing, and I'm a little confused because at one point we talk about lost forage, and then the next point we talk about damage. Do we have a definition for what damage is on rangelands, or is it lost forage that we're talking about? Because those words are kind of used synonymously, and then we get into page 5 where it talks about individualized harm, and I'm not so sure what individualized harm, whether that's damage or lost forage. But do we have a definition of what constitutes damage? Is that fences? Is it water infrastructure, pipelines, troughs? Is it forage? Is it stock ponds? What constitutes damage into the definition that the department has through rules versus lost forage? Because those are used interchanged throughout this current bill draft. And for me, it's a little confusing. So maybe you can help if there is definitions for those two.
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, thank you. We do have a definition of damage in commission rule. It's fairly lengthy, but it includes actual consumption. We do not have anything about specific to lost forage, although loss to land and growing cultivated crops and things like that might be construed to be included in that.
So the way this is currently structured, Mr. Chairman.
Follow up. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. Damage would follow under damage, but what we're talking here when we're talking about lost forage gets back to probably your definition for extraordinary losses to rangeland. So it's just something that we need to capture and probably clean up in the bill draft, because I think it's inconsistent with what the current rules are, the way the department determines extraordinary loss. It would be consistent with lost forage, not necessarily damage. Would you guys agree with that? I mean, I'm just, as we move through work in the bill, Mr. Chairman, that's a question, because right now we've used them synonymously in here, but under rules, they are not.
Director.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks. Yeah, I would agree that we need to just look at this entire bill and see if we can make it more simplified and make it more consistent with the terminology we're using. I mean, if it's complicated, it's going to be hard to administer. So we need to look at that.
Any more questions from the committee? Representative Davis.
Maybe this is just a comment, but you're looking at what's kind of spawned this are the two herds, the Iron Mountain and the Laramie Peak, and they're over 50% of the damages that you're paying out in your assessment. To meet that assessment, is there a minimum and a maximum that you would participate, hunter wise, if I allow 4 hunters on my private ground, do I meet the ability or the threshold to qualify for damages on where if we have so many elk on my private ground, would my minimum be raised to, say, 200 hunters? Is that formulated in there anywhere, or just a observation, just a question?
Deputy Director.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Davis. Yes, within our rules, to qualify by allowing enough hunters, we specify that a landowner or a claimant needs to provide enough access to basically offset the amount of recruitment into that segment of the population, and that landowner would be required to provide enough access to harvest at least 5 elk to offset that recruitment. We do know in some cases, for instance, that population numbers may be above a landowner's ability to allow enough access, or licenses may not be high enough to allow enough access to meet that based on a larger scale. So we certainly take that into consideration when visiting with landowners and discussing the amount of hunters that need to be allowed access.
Senator French.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Excuse me. Along those lines, and I just referred to myself and my neighbors, you know, when the hunters, how many, when we have, oh, here shortly, we'll have 350 head come in at night, our normal night raider herd. There's a lot of elk that does a lot of damage. But the hunters rarely, well, they have no ability to shoot them. So can't myself and my neighbors say, okay, instead of, 350, they'd have to allow a lot of people through. Can't let's say, okay, gonna allow 4 or 5, 10 that we know that are good hunters, accurate shooter, the responsible type hunters, versus maybe, well, to pursue any damage claim, you've got to allow 200 people across your place. It's kind of a sticking point with, well, I'll be honest, myself and my neighbors, that, do we have to allow everybody to come through? And 99% of the hunters are great. They're terrific. They're very responsible. And I respect them for that. And but there's some, I used to just be wide open, let everybody go through. Well, one time I had a storm and the ground was really soft, and they pulled out, they wouldn't use my private farm road. They wanted to go across, shorter. So they go out in the field and get stuck. So they're like, oh, geez. Well, they chain up in an active hayfield. You know what I mean? Clear across. So until the hayfield years and years later was plowed out, every time we go across it with a swath or bale, whatever, boom, boom, boom. It's just kind of a sticking point that maybe to file for a claim, you've got to allow everybody and their dog through, versus being selective and say, okay, well, good luck, but you choose. Like these 10 people that have asked, 8 or 9 of them are great. I'll let you through, give you permission, or let you on the property. And the other one, sorry, and you kind of know in your neighborhood who's responsible and who's not. So any comments along that? And I know our area is pretty unique area and damage wise and stuff with that local herd. Any comments along that? Thank you.
Deputy Director.
Mr. Chairman, Senator French, I guess you've done a nice job of highlighting some of the issues that folks deal with occasionally. Hopefully it's not the norm, but we're certainly aware of that. In terms of the ability to monitor hunters and things like that, and how to I guess apply some discretion in those regards. We are certainly aware in some places animals are not available. For instance, if they only come in at night, it's pretty tough to say you have to harvest 100 animals if they're not available during legal shooting hours, or in cases where oftentimes animals come in the winter after a season's already closed and they're not present during a normal season. It's not up to us to say you didn't allow enough hunters. We have to have that discretion and work with folks on an individual basis to ensure that they're doing what they are in the spirit of the regulation if the animals are present. So it does create some issues, but our folks have the discretion to consider each of those individual situations and make a determination based on those circumstances. If that helps.
Follow up.
Quick follow-up, Mr. Co-Chair. So you do have the ability to look at individual cases and say, well, geez, you know, the night raiders, nobody could get anything, but they allowed 10 hunters on their property or through their whatever. So you have that discretion to look at that and say, okay, he's filed a claim for whatever, 100,000.
Individual basis. I don't want to make a broad claim that every single situation out there is eligible for that. It really is up to the discretion on the individual level between the landowner and the game warden and that regional supervisor to determine the circumstances specific to each case. But to answer your broader question, our folks do have that discretion to make those allowances when animals are not present during legal hunting hours.
Senator Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, a question, and it seems like sometimes we tend to get fixated on an issue and then don't understand the overall arching ramifications of what we're doing. And so when we use the terminology lost forage, it's much broader than just grass. And this comes back to calculating those losses and what constitutes a loss. So in my area, I still have a number of sheep operations, and we run microhistological analysis where you go in and you collect the fecal samples and you run those through and you see what the animal's actually eating. And we have on occasion found that with some of our domestic sheep, when winters where we have a little heavier snow, that 60% of their diet is big sagebrush. And then we have overlapping big game winter range. In this case, it may not be elk. We do the same thing for mule deer and antelope. And we've seen in some cases antelope, you guys are aware of this, 90% of their diet is big sagebrush. So what happens when, and I've got a number of sheep producers that have substantial amount of private property that overlap with particularly antelope winter range and stuff. And so, you know, this program, the way this is structured, if somebody wanted to come in and put a request in for compensation due to lost forage, that encompasses big sagebrush in those type of scenarios. And is the department contemplated, number one, how do you measure lost forage associated with browsers instead of grazers, I guess, is the overall question, because I can tell you I've got some pretty sharp sheep producers down in my country that would love to see this and make a claim on shrubs, not just necessarily grass. And so is there discussions on how that would operate through rules as far as, again, back to methodologies, factors, what kind of time constraints would it take to do that? I mean, having done a number of clippings to evaluate carrying capacity and stuff, it's tremendous. And what's that look like?
Chief. So, Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, you bring up a good point that these can be a little tricky and complicated to work through, and having the ability to address those issues in regulation, I think is pretty important. In my mind, I'm pretty simple-minded that folks know they can't make things too complicated or the chief's not going to get it. So in my mind, just using animal counts would be one method that we could use. So count just like extraordinary damage to grass now, count the number of critters that are out there, how much time they're out there, and convert that to AUMs, and not have to make a determination as to what percent of that is browse and what percentage of that is grass. I think that would be one method that we could implement that would be pretty straightforward.
Mr. Chairman, and I'm
Follow up.
getting the weeds just a little here, but all AUMs are calculated based on herbaceous vegetation. We don't ever calculate shrub production in the calculation of AUMs, which particularly for mule deer and antelope, and to a lesser extent, we've seen on tough winters substantial shrub utilization by elk when there's nothing else available. So again, the complication is AUMs doesn't work in those type of scenarios. So it requires some other unforeseen or unknown methodology, but it's just not as easy as going out and clipping grass. And I just want to make sure people understand when we're talking about lost forage, it's much broader than just grass for cattle. It can be a substantial component of domestic livestock's diet and wildlife.
Director.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, leave it to Senator Hicks to come up with something we've never thought of before. This isn't the first time, but it's a very valid point. And I think where the chief was going is that one thing we do have some pretty good information on is that animals, depending on the species, have a requirement of so many pounds per day. And so, one particular method that the local folks would have the discretion to be able to do this under this bill, if it were to pass, would be to just simply figure out what their daily needs would be, however many pounds of forage they would need per day, calculate the number of animals that were causing or consuming the forage, and then do a calculation that way. But there's a lot of these very nuanced. I mean, you start talking about things like sunflowers, and you start talking about all the different seed crops like alfalfa seed, and our folks have had to do some pretty.
Or one of you do that we need to talk about in relation to the bill. But one of the things, I guess I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here as we move forward. We all agree that the bill needs some work. It's not ready to go anywhere today. But one of the questions I have is at our last meeting, we were talking about the idea that the elk herd being over the management number, the ideal management number, constitutes damage in and of itself. And that's what I left the meeting perceiving we were talking about, because it's going to be hard for some of these landowners to prove damage because they've dwindled down their cow herds, their sheep flocks in response to the fact that they have too many elk. And so the grass maybe doesn't necessarily look different than it did the year before or the year before that, because they're not running as many cattle or sheep as they have historically been able to do. So I think my thought was we were trying to get away from the idea that they actually have to go out and prove the damage. The bill as drafted, I don't think captures that idea. Is the department on the same page as us there, or is there still going to be, according as the bill draft is written today, do you believe we still have to be, landowners are going to have to prove actual damage on the ground in relation to the herd, elk herd, which is overpopulated?
So, Mr. Chairman, so it is my understanding that your intent is that if an elk herd is over objective in those non-irrigated, the situations that aren't covered in the damage regulation currently, that would constitute damage. I think one thing though that's important for us is that we still need that notification that damage is occurring, and we need the ability to go out there and investigate it. We need the ability to try to mitigate it. And we need the ability to work with landowners to try to continue to allow harvest and bring that herd to objective. And so all I would ask is that as we work through this bill, that reporting of damage is still a component of a landowner's responsibility. So I think an earlier version, it basically was more or less just give the bill to the department and we'd have to pay it. And that's going to be problematic for us. So as long as we meet your intent, it would be very helpful though that the reporting
Out that we had, it was just an annual payment if we were overpopulation, because it's not a given that damage will occur on a certain landowner's parcel. I mean, there could be landowners in that area that aren't being damaged. And so I don't think it wasn't my intention in moving this bill forward to create just a automatic payment and an automatic program of some sort. So we need to find that good balance between there is an overpopulation in this area and damages occurring, and we may have reduced our herd sizes because of it, and making sure that we're not paying someone who isn't damaged for no good reason. So as we work, I think the co-chairman and I have agreed that this bill isn't ready for prime time. This is a great discussion, and it's how we come to good legislation by doing this work today. And so I'm not sure how you want to proceed, but we may want to get a smaller working group to work with the Game and Fish on this, someone who might be on the task force that's working on this. And we could get this put together and get the language tightened up a little bit. And so up to your discretion, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Co-Chairman Steinmetz. I think we have one more question down here. Representative Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One last maybe observation is the migratory routes. Okay, our place, we get substantial overgrazing in the spring as they're heading up. And, how would that be addressed or accounted for in this damage to forage? In a drought year, it's more impactful than in this year. I just don't want to set up something that we're gonna be on the welfare on.
Any response? So I have one other question, I guess, and as we keep moving down this road, do we have any ideas or is there any way to find out what the cost of this additional program would be, this additional damage program? Is there a way to max, a max cost and then what it's actually going to cost based on statistics from other damage claims? I mean, is there
I think we'd come up with some ballpark estimates. I don't think we'll have anything extremely precise, but we can give you something ballpark, I think.
And I think that's sufficient. I mean, we're not going to hold you to the penny, but just so we have a rough idea of what we're actually looking at before we bail in feet first. I agree with the co-chairman. I think we can establish a smaller group, and maybe she and I can work on figuring out who's on that group to work with the director and Mr. McGagna and whoever else at the department that needs to be part of the conversation. And obviously LSO needs to be in on that as well, so they can help us get the right language on the page. So if you want to address your amendment real quick, or we can deal with that in our working group as we move forward. And then I know you had a brucellosis update, and then we'll try to get to some public comment here as quick as we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Co-Chair. So just real quickly on brucellosis. So as many of you know, brucellosis largely eradicated across most of the country and livestock, thanks to the hard work of a lot of folks over many decades. We still have a reservoir of brucellosis that persists in wild elk and bison in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And so over the many years, the department's worked hard in cooperation with livestock producers to try to mitigate that risk of spreading brucellosis from elk primarily to livestock. Each year, the department has an extensive testing program. We test elk on our feed grounds. Our feed ground elk generally have a fairly high prevalence rate of brucellosis exposure. It can be upwards of 50% of the cow elk on feed grounds could show exposure to brucellosis. Outside of our feed grounds, we rely heavily on hunters to help us with that brucellosis surveillance. So each year we send out about 8,000 to 10,000 blood collection test tubes to hunters in different areas around the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and ask them to submit a blood sample for us. We have a really good response rate, and thanks to the really excellent work of some of our lab staff in Laramie, we're able to use most all of the blood samples that come in. So for example, last year we had just over 1,000 samples come in. We were able to use about 970 of those to test for brucellosis. So that surveillance elk on the east or west slope of the Bighorns, and one was just outside of the Lander Riverton country. We do know there are a lot of concerns about brucellosis, and so for this fall, we're stepping up our efforts. We'll continue to do the surveillance that we've always done, but we've asked our personnel in the southwest corner of the state to redouble their efforts. We've hired some technicians and have given the charge that they'll try to boost our sample size for that very southern end of the Wyoming range in that herd unit. So we'll continue to have our sampling efforts, and we're going to expand and increase our efforts to make sure we have a good sample.
Any questions from the committee? All right, if not, we'll thank the department for being here. Really appreciate it. It was super helpful, and we'll be in contact shortly about working on the bill draft. This time we'll do some public comment on any of the topics we've covered so far. Just remind everybody that as you come to the mic, please identify yourself, address all comments through the chairman, and please adhere to the decorum rules. Which, you have any question what those are, there's a hard copy over by the door. So Mr. McGagna, please. And just to speed things up, if you want to get in line, we can have a couple folks sitting at the table and pass the mic down. So just come on up if you're wanting to speak, and we'll keep going.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim McGaggan with the Wyoming Stockgrowers Association. First of all, I want to thank the committee and the co-chairs for moving this issue forward that we brought to you at your last meeting. While this bill takes a little different approach than what we had proposed, I believe it moves in the right direction and addresses that issue. Many of the comments and questions here today represent some of the concerns that we had, so I won't repeat all of that. But I think the two key points I would make is that here we are talking about something beyond what you can get for damages. These people in these areas, like all other areas of the state, are already eligible for damages if they meet the qualifications. So I think the term lost forage is a critical term here, because we're saying, even if you didn't have, and Mr. Chairman, I believe you used the example, I think the emphasis needs to be kept on lost forage. Also, our position would be in regards to the valid issues that Senator Hicks has raised, that AUM should be the method of compensation, that we're not measuring grass. We're saying There's an AUM established for a cow or a sheep. There's one established for elk. And if you exceeded this many extra elk, you consumed of whatever plants or forage, that much of AUMs that would otherwise be available on the allotment, not necessarily the ones that would be consumed on the allotment. Just a couple of other things with regard to the bill, and since you're going to be working on it, these can all be addressed. But on page 6, lines 1, 2, 3, additional proof of damage. This seemed to imply more damage proof than you need under the current existing section C. And so we would suggest that be removed from the bill as we move forward. And also that because this new section J is dependent on the rest of this bill, that perhaps if you do maintain extraordinary damage to grass or damage non-irrigated rangelands, as is on page 2, lines 9 through 11, that we would add in there or loss of forage, so that it's as provided in subsection J, so that we're quickly distinguishing that this new subsection deals with loss of forage, even if there's no actual damage to the resource, and that the existing sections do not address that. With that, Mr. Chairman, commend you for agreeing to go forward and work on the details in this. And we certainly stand ready to work with you to develop a bill that can be workable from the perspective of the game and fish, as well as the landowners that are impacted by these excess populations. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Any questions from the committee? And I assume you're willing to serve on any subcommittee we put together to work on the issue.
I'd help in whatever way you deem appropriate. Yes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. McGagna. Please introduce yourself.
Mr. Chairman, Kent Connolly, Lincoln County Commissioner, but also Vice Chair of the Coalition of Local Governments, which is the entire southwestern Wyoming. Couple things specific targeting the west. The western hasn't been talked about, of the world's largest migratory range. Okay, clear coming through the Wyoming range, which my county is the biggest portion of, representing over a 5 to 10 year period already. And I believe this bill is very reflective of what that's representative of and what is coming down the future. The 1.8 million acres that the governor opposed immediately, that the RMP in Rock Springs announced, which is takes three counties, will affect how this goes. And not only that effect, Pinedale and Kemmer are already admitting that they will have to change how they manage their policies based on that. What this means in simple terms is you're forcing the elk to go to places, they'll go to the private, no doubt about it. Down in my area, that means they're down in a mine, and where I manage as a private business, in 400 head this year, 200 to 300 the year before, worst winter. Also watched them pile up in different places. The mismanagement of the federal lands, or the lack of federal land management, should be part of your discussion and a heavy lift to determine what to do. I'm home to Fossil Butte National Monument. That mismanagement alone creates huge issues. On a bird refuge next to me that took 10 years to be able to get the population of elk off of it and transfer back and forth. So the decisions you have, and this is a heavy lift I'm going to ask you for. This is a federal government that is not playing where they should be playing. This is overreach in how they manage ACECs. Those ACECs will tell you, yeah, we can do this with them, we can do that with them. But the bottom line is it will restrict access. And as you heard from very good descriptions out of them, what they talked about, how they manage their herds, the Uinta herd, what is in there. But I'm talking about the Wyoming mule range deer herd. The shrub issue is absolutely what Senator Hicks said. You want to hear, get in one of my public meetings and get torn apart, is start talking about how the preservation of that herd is. I've been very much a part of the underpasses, overpasses in that migratory thing, but you are forcing, with the policies of the federal government, is forcing your reaction to damage. Your damages are going up because of where you're forcing the elk to go to. And so anything you can do in your context of what you look at on this subject to make the federal partners play better with us. And that's a big lift I'm asking. I realize that. But the bottom line is 77% of where you said is federal land. They are the landowners. Okay. If they don't play with us on the right level and put the proper perspectives into place, this isn't going to get better for you as a legislative body on what you ask for money for what they need to do to not only support the sportsmen. These takings, which we refer to them out of the 1.8 million, there is not a party at the table. I don't care what your spectrum is from green to down through the hunting world and the whole world. Everybody opposes that 1.0. It's a takings. Taking a position out of the legislature. I do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brett Moline, Wyoming Farm Bureau Federation. I do have a few comments on this bill. I will put them in writing and get them to the task force. I would strongly encourage the task force to look at that issue of having to allow hunting. That is an issue that my members have brought up throughout the state, that you only hear about things that go wrong, but some claims for crops have been denied because they couldn't show, this was a few years ago under different administration, but their claims were denied because they couldn't show that they had allowed hunting. Well, the animals aren't there. They're in a different hunt area. When they migrate out, they're in a different area. So that issue does need to be resolved. I do want to end on a bit of a positive note. I know that's unusual for me, but last week I was on a national conference call with other Farm Bureau staff throughout the state. And I do want to compliment the state of Wyoming and the Game and Fish Commission in particular on having this damage program. A lot of states don't have it. They're running into the same issues we are. Population of wildlife is coming up. The number of hunters is going down. So sometimes it takes other people to point out we do have a good program, but we can always make it better. And I think that's all of our goal. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll shut up and take any questions you or the committee may have.
Any questions for Mr. Moline?
Thank you.
Any other public comment on game and fish issues here today? Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chairman, fellow committee members, thanks for being here in Pinedale, and thanks to Director Nesbitt for being here when he's got to drive clear back across the state to Gillette today to be to his commission meeting. So thanks to him. In this area, probably our biggest worry, at least my biggest worry, is what the Game and Fish ultimately does with their elk feed ground management plan. We have not that much damage because we have that in place. If we end up not feeding elk, there's going to be an incredible amount of damage. Not only damage to the number of elk and the herds that are here in this area, but damage to all the livestock operators. And so I urge this committee, as you go forward on this issue, to just kind of keep your pulse on that issue. Basically transferring AUMs or making AUMs, elk AUMs, and we go down that path, and we've lost livestock production in Western Wyoming. And so I urge you to keep an eye on that. And I think the bill isn't a bad bill. This is, the bill you've got here, it needs some work, but you're going down the right path. You just need to keep plugging on it. So the old extraordinary damage to grass never has worked right. Let's compensate producers for these over objective herds in a reasonable manner. Let the department have broad authority to figure that out. You can always come in again if you don't like what they've done, but I think they'll take the time to do it right. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Any questions for the speaker? All right. Any other public comment? All right. If not, we will close public comment on the game and fish issues for the day. And I think we'll take about a a little bit behind schedule. I was hoping to get done about 10 minutes ago. But we'll take about a 10-minute break and be back at 10:40. Are we ready, Katie? All right, thank you. All right, Director, we have you and Dr. Hazel here to talk to us about brucellosis, and if you want to proceed, that would be fantastic.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Co-Chair, committee members, thank you. It's good to see you. If it would please the committee, since we missed your June meeting, if I can give a quick agency update and then turn it over to Dr. Hazel. As you mentioned, Dr. Hazel, State Veterinarian, here with me, Steve True, Director at the Livestock Board. Quickly, a couple things, just a couple of notes for the committee. We do have 2 new members on our board this year. Martin Mercer from Bighorn Crawford of Crook County had gone forward, have been Weston Jones and Hot Springs County have replaced those 2 board members. Had a couple meetings since last we spoke. Thank you. We've met here in Pinedale in June in response to HBO 180. In the last session, started that process of developing a protocol. Our timing was bad in that we thought we'd be ahead of the movement to the Green River Drift and hit the exact time when everybody was on their way up the mountain. So that didn't work out just the best. We had a meeting just recently in Rock Springs on August 22nd, and Dr. Hazel did a training on the 21st, or an educational meeting. I'll stay away from that and let her speak to you of that. Also on board business, we recently got back finalized and signed changes to our Chapter 6 rules, which are brucellosis compensation. That was in response to Senate File 29 in the last session, where we changed the way we will pay veterinarians for the brucellosis testing compensation. We just finished a brand renewal. We've renewed a total of 4,801 brands as of today. There's still a few delinquents being renewed. That puts us at about a percentage of 79%, which is about apropos for every renewal. As the economy changes, we were concerned we may have a lower participation rate, but that has not been the case since in the past renewal. Mention quickly, Dr. Hazel and I both serve on an advisory council for the State Vet Lab in Laramie. We've been working with the College of Ag in regards to some lab services through that council, and also as an agency with blended missions. The lab and our missions blend. I will say no more about that. You have UW personnel here who could speak to that in better case. And lastly, on an update for the agency, and particularly for Senator Hicks, in 2019, he brought around legislation for a law enforcement reimbursement account. Just to let you know, you had carried that over in the last biennium, the balance forward. And at this time, going into the end of this biennium, we had a balance of $174,000, of which $105,000 is currently encumbered under contracts. So we'll have $33,000 roughly remaining. If that's available for other expenses outside of those MOUs, we may or may not spend it, but just put that out there in case the legislature or this committee would care to carry that again, that balance, or augment that again. In that note, our senior investigator will be in Tulare, California in September at the Rural Crime Task Force School. This is a great school that's attended by rural law enforcement and investigators from all around the country. It is a way to link that rural crime to agricultural crime to livestock crime. Senator Hicks particularly will remember the conversations we had about we're all looking for the same guy in those cases. So we're looking forward to Investigator Strang coming back from that, and maybe with some other ideas on how to take a next step in this program. So, Mr. Chairman, unless there's questions on an update, that's a quick update for the Livestock Board, and I'd be happy to answer questions or turn it over to Dr. Hazel.
Any questions for the director? Co-Chairman Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What do you need from us to carry that over if we decided to do that? Is that just a budget request from you, or do you need a bill from us? What do you need?
Mr. Chairman, Madam Co-Chair, I think the last time it was just a footnote put into the 300 in the carryover. If we brought to you the balance, brought to JAC the balance at the session, but just as this is the committee that fostered that legislation, I want you to be the first to know where we're at and whether you care to proceed with that or not. So I think that's just a budgeting process in JAC. Senator Hicks can reply to that.
Yeah, so Madam Chairman or Mr. Chairman, probably the best way to do that would be for this committee and through the chairman just to send a letter to the Joint Appropriations Committee recommending from this committee, if we were so to take a position, it's just to say that we would recommend allowing those funds in that account to be carried forward and maybe restore some additional funding if it thought the utilization for the balance was not sufficient for the biennium. But that would be the most logical way to address this is because it is a budget year. Director will be before the JAC. And if we would send a letter recommending that those funds be carried over or any additional funds to make sure that there's sufficient dollars for that purposes, that would be the best way to do that, is to actually get it into the budget.
Senator Larson.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I guess I would ask, are you including that in your budget request?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Larson, we have not included that, and we didn't the last time. We just brought forward the balance, which was quite a bit higher last time. We now have 7 active counties in the MOUs in the state, and several of you are in those counties. They're Bighorn, Sheridan, Weston, Hot Springs, Natrona, Fremont, and Lincoln counties all have MOUs for targeted enforcement with us. We would probably, with that balance, have the ability to do 2 more counties, and we're in talks with UNA right now. So we may very well deplete the balance of that. I think it's valuable, and I think the sheriffs would be happy to visit with you about that as well at a later time.
So this might be a question for you, Director, or for Senator Hicks. Do we need to augment that dollar amount and put that in our letter request to JAC? What would that look like? And I think the co-chairman and I are of the opinion that we probably take a vote on that today and have the committee vote on whether or not we send the letter, and exactly what's in the letter would be helpful. So if either one of you could help us with that, that'd be great.
Mr. Chairman, this money will be gone, or the carryover will be gone at the end of this fiscal year. So in order to start the new budget year with any money, we'll either need to carry a balance or re-augment, reappropriate. It was a one-time appropriation brought forward by the Ag Committee in 2019, and then the balance has just been carried each time.
But Mr. Chairman, just a little edification for the committee. When we first started this program, it was a pilot, and that's why it wasn't part of the standard budget within the agency. We were looking at law enforcement issues specific to ag theft, primarily livestock. And so rather than hire a bunch more additional investigators, discussion between the Ag Committee at that time and the Sheriff's Association is looking at some level of compensation to have them help step up and do more policing and patrol for livestock theft. So that's the genesis of this program, but because it was a pilot program, it was never inserted as part of the standard budget. I think part of that request would be for the agency, working with the executive branch, the governor's office, is to incorporate this into part of your standard budget. And then we would forward a recommendation to both the JAC and the governor's office with that recommendation. And I guess what we're going to need, Steve, is a dollar value of what your current annual utilization is, how that looks going forward in a biennial budget. In other words, 2 years would be the recommended dollar amount that we put in there, and probably a few extra dollars in case if it's anticipated a couple more counties wanted to come on board. So I don't know if you have those numbers now, but Mr. Chairman, I think that's what we would need.
Thank you, Senator. That's very helpful. Senator French.
Yeah, that was my question. What kind of funds are we talking about? If that's brought into the standard budget and before governor's office and JAC, what do you anticipate continuing the program and potentially over the next 2 years over the biennium budget, additional counties are coming on board? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senators, currently The MOU part of the program is $105,000. We have the 7 counties. Each MOU is 15,000. Now, a few of them have used all their money each time, and a few of them have not. So we've just rolled them back up to the 15,000 as we recontract. So we don't go above that 15,000 per contract, or we haven't to this time. And we have spent, I'd have to get you the numbers. We've spent a few $1,000s on some other criminal activities that the sheriffs were not able to pay for. A couple necropsies on some cases and a few other things. So there's some other ways, statutory flexibility in there for what would be spent for. But right now it's 105,000 a year on those contracts. Those are 1-year contracts. So 7, so it'd be 225. The original appropriation was $250,000 when it came forced in 2019. So yeah, it's hard for me to say because some counties don't spend near all of it, but they want to stay in the MOU.
Thank you, Director. Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With this program, how many successful prosecutions have you had across the state when it came to animal theft or if I understand this correctly, just what's the outcome of this program over the years? Could you give a brief history? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, I can give you some history. Prosecution wise, I would always turn to a case we had in Albany County that's still alive there, but there was a case of livestock property and hay theft. And the gentleman is currently incarcerated in Florida on related type charges. He hasn't been tried here yet. And he may not be extradited. He may spend enough time there that we never prosecute here. Arrest wise, there's been a few arrests, and there's always a deterrent factor that we are extremely pleased with and impossible to measure by putting these deputies' cars out in the rural areas where they're not normally seen and forcing some folks to move different directions. That's where I would put it now. We have 3 cases pending right now under investigation that I wouldn't comment on in public.
Any more questions? Co-Chairman Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since we have a new committee, since we wrote this legislation quite a while ago, could you remind us how many enforcement officers we had in the brand office statewide and correlate the costs we were paying for that program versus what we're doing now with our partnerships with the sheriff's offices and the MOUs? And do you have those figures in front of you? I didn't mean to put you off guard, but I just can't remember. It's been quite a few years ago, but if you could, that would be just a ballpark.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Co-Chair, I'm going to ballpark that in. Prior to the changes in our staffing, we had a little over $1 million budget for personnel in that department. Now personnel and operations, bulk of which is travel, because I have 2 currently that are everywhere all the time. So their travel expenses are quite high. A third of that. So this appropriation took the place of maybe a person and a half at that time. The more investigators, the better, but I think this program has served us well. It served us well in many facets, one of which is in animal welfare cases and investigations around the state, which the committee is probably remembers. We are now in an advise and consult role in that, because there's no way 2 officers could answer every call in the state, but just the prosecutions and citations and investigations of those cases on the county level with the oversight of our 2 investigators has been outstanding, I think. So I think that we're doing all we can with 2 guys. I'm not here before you to ask for more positions. I wouldn't do that. But I think this
program could use this augmentation in another way. And I think there's more steps going forward in order to increase our play with our county cooperators.
Any more questions from the committee? If not, just so we can check a box off, I'd entertain a motion to direct the co-chairman to send a letter to JAC and the governor, Senator Larson. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? All right, hearing none, all in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign. All right, that motion passes. On to the next topic, Director.
Mr. Chairman, and unless there are other questions, and I will bring you some more direct dollars for that prior to your October meeting. I'd be happy to turn the mic over to Dr. Hazel for her update.
Thank you, Director. Doctor.
Good morning and thank you, Representative Craigo. Just some quick updates, not just brucellosis, but a few other items that might be of interest to you. In the right spot for this. Might be of interest to you that are occurring within our state at the moment that we are working on. First of all, just to let everybody know, we did have 2 of our veterinarians at the Wyoming State Fair this year. Want to say thank you to the Livestock Fair Board Wyoming State Fair Board for all of the improvements in the processes for our exhibits and exhibitors with regards to livestock. They've made some changes that are very significant and we are highly appreciative. Also, we worked with other agencies doing avian influenza surveillance, of which we have not, quote, had any this summer in our state or many states across the US, which we are highly thankful for. Don't ask me why, we can't explain that. Don't know, but we haven't. We have not, Game and Fish has. Thank you. But we did it. We cooperated with USDA Veterinary Services, USDA Wildlife Services, and a team from the Wyoming State Veterinary Lab to test approximately 120 poultry at the state fair for avian influenza, of which all were negative. So that went very well. Thanks to everybody for that. We also have our new assistant state veterinarian, Dr. Rose DG Antonio, with us, not here today, but she started with us about 2 weeks ago. The day we went to Green River and met with all of our producers out there. So she had quite day 1 of her position. We're happy to have her with us. Regarding brucellosis, we have our 2 herds under quarantine currently. We have 1 in Park County. That herd has 1 more herd test this October. If all is negative, they should be cleared and released from quarantine, hopefully. The second one we have, as you know, is in Sweetwater County, 1 herd under quarantine. That is a smaller herd, only about 30 head, more of a hobby type herd. And we've actually removed about 8 reactors out of that herd thus far. So it was a herd that had a significant number of reactors in it. We're currently working with that herd regarding management moving forward. And I can answer more questions about that later. And we have on that particular herd, though, we have worked traces through Wyoming and also in Utah. Utah is very aware of that herd. And cooperating very well with us. And I want to really thank Wyoming Game and Fish Department for increasing their surveillance in that portion of Wyoming in the southwest corner. That is vital for our stakeholders to prove that we do not hopefully have it in our elk population. And that's exactly the news that our stakeholders need to hear. So hopefully after this hunting season, we can say that very clearly. That we do not have it in our elk population. We've not found it in any of the traces that we've completed with this herd. In other words, all animals that went into that herd, we trace those herds of origin and we trace the herds that may have purchased cattle from this herd. Since it was a very small herd and all of their sales and purchases were made through 1 livestock auction, that narrowed it down for us significantly, thankfully. And we're still finishing up some of those traces. Some of those herds can't be tested until they come off of public grazing land. And so those tests won't be completed until basically in later October or November. But all the traces we've made thus far have been clean. We're thankful to report it's just the 1 herd. That herd does have direct links to the DSA. They were in the DSA up until 2019. They did not do any violations that we're aware of. They have tested exactly like they were supposed to back then and have made all their purchases through the market. So we don't foresee any violations that occurred. It's a matter of when science meets reality. Sometimes not all tests are foolproof and they didn't necessarily do anything wrong, but we are doing further research on those traces. A couple other issues that we're dealing with, just so that you're aware of them. We've had a significant number of West Nile positive cases in equine this year. Not surprising, given the rainfall that we've had throughout our state. I don't know if you've heard, but other states across the US are having very similar issues. The states that have had significant rainfall. This is as of September 5th, we had 25 West Nile positive, 13 that were negative. However, when you're testing for West Nile, it's difficult to find it, same as in humans, if you don't have the right sample at just the right time. So we had 25 positive, 13 negative, 7 that are pending, and 4 that did not show, that showed clinical signs but were not tested. Those are just the ones we knew about in about a 3-week period. The highest number of cases is in Fremont County, and then they're kind of spread across Sweetwater County, Sheridan County, Bighorn County, Campbell County, in that region. The one thing that we're going to impress upon our producers or our equine owners is that all of these cases could probably be prevented with simple vaccination. There's a very, very effective West Nile vaccination out there, and we're trying to get that point across to our producers or our equine enthusiasts, equine owners, to let them know that a simple vaccination followed by label guidelines of booster vaccinations can prevent this disease from occurring. Quite often it is fatal. In about 50% of cases, if not more, it is fatal to our equine. There are also some human cases, and so we've worked with Wyoming Department of Public Health on some of this as well, and they'll have information on the human cases on their website. But most of that is due to the increase in mosquito population that we have in our state this year. So another situation that we're coordinating with or collaborating with Wyoming Department of Public Health is leptospirosis. And that is a bacterial disease that we see in dogs, can also be seen in other species such as cattle. But it's a bacterial disease, and it can spread. Rodents are the primary vector of that disease, but it can also be passed through water, contaminated feces, contaminated pasture, grass, etc., runoff. We've seen it so far in 6 dogs, and actually we have 6 dogs right now, but we have 3 more cases reported from our veterinarians right now. It's pretty much just in the Cheyenne area, literally just in the Cheyenne region. We could be up to 9 cases in dogs and 1 human case by the end of the day today. And this is really concerning. It's a disease that is highly zoonotic. Whenever you do have a human with the disease, it is very damaging. It can cause severe kidney failure, liver failure. The 1 human that we had with it was hospitalized in Denver for at least a week, if not longer, with the disease. It too can be prevented with vaccination in our dogs, but it's not a vaccine that we use very commonly. We'll be sending out a press release in collaboration with Wyoming Public Health, probably either today or tomorrow, with more about this and the increased number of cases that we're seeing and encouraging vaccine by our veterinarians. And that'll sum up the major events that we're currently working on. I answer any questions.
Representative Conrad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question for you, Doctor. We had talked about legislation. In fact, I believe we passed legislation surrounding brucellosis management communication earlier. Do you feel that was effective in these 2 cases you noted? Was the matrix that it worked? Did everyone get notified appropriately and accordingly?
Dr. Hazel.
Chairman Craig, Representative Conrad. We're working on so to back up just a little bit, the 2 cases, one of the cases that I think Sweetwater was after that was passed too. Both these cases in brucellosis were actually after were notified after a lot of legislation was passed. We're currently working on that legislative protocol. With the Sweetwater case, that protocol we've kind of utilized some of the thoughts we're putting into that protocol for the Sweetwater case. I think it has been very helpful. Having the producer meeting that we had in Sweetwater County, we had approximately 45 producers there in person and another about 25 or so on Zoom, along with 4 veterinarians attending. So some of that protocol has put into place, and we'll have it formally written within the short future.
Thank you.
Yes.
Senator French.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Doctor, what kind of advancements are being made on maybe eradicating brucellosis nationwide? I mean, science is improving, research is improving every year. We're wanting to put somebody on Mars to walk around or ride a dune buggy on Mars, and bring them home. What kind of research, what kind of advances are there? I mean, that for a cure for that or whatever should really be advancing. Can you cite anything? Thank you.
Doctor.
Representative or Chairman Craig or Representative French or Senator French, I'm sorry. I think actually putting somebody on Mars might be easier than solving brucellosis issues that we have currently, seriously. And I'll direct some of this to our game and fish folks, but brucellosis was eradicated from the United States in our cattle population many years ago, using primarily a vaccine, removing the positive animals or reactor animals from the herd, and then using vaccine to eradicate the rest of that or to prevent the disease from occurring. The biggest issue we have right now is in our wildlife population, as Game and Fish mentioned, just in the Yellowstone region. So just in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, in our wildlife population, primarily elk, we have a Brucella issue. Developing a vaccine for the elk is extremely complicated. One of those complications is the fact that we're not allowed to do outdoor research on Brucella abortus because it is considered a select agent. In other words, an agent that can be used for warfare by DHS. We, along with basically everybody in the United States except DHS, has requested that that be removed from the select agent list many times so that we can do outdoor research. Until that is removed from the select agent list, it's very difficult to do any research on that situation or on that issue. That every 2 years, the select agent list is reviewed and it's up for review again. And they have said DHS has promised USDA Vet Services they will take a hard look at that and that they might be ready to remove it based on the science of transmission, remove that from the select agent list. If that occurs, vaccine trials might be possible, specifically for wildlife. We have a good vaccine in cattle, but we don't have one for wildlife. The vaccine that we have for cattle is not effective in elk. And that's a very long explanation.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Co-Chair. With these advancements, where there's these elk feed grounds around the state, is there anything that can be put that the elk would still eat? And I think they use pellets or whatever, hay pellets, whatever they use in these feed grounds, something in that the elk eat and would help to eliminate brucellosis?
Dr. Hazel.
Representative Craig, Senator French, I will defer to my game and fish counterparts to respond to that question. We make it a point to stay in our respective lanes, and so I'm going to defer to game and fish regarding that question.
Senator Ide.
Sure, Chair. The good county commissioner brought a point up about our federal partners, quote, federal partners on a lot of the issues we have in Wyoming. This may be a little off subject, but we've got this holding area for wild horses in Platte County. And I don't know if you could comment on, I don't know a whole lot about it, but they did have some quarantine issues there. I don't know if we interact with our quote federal partners in that situation over there with that holding of the wild horses. Maybe it's a question for both the doctor and the livestock board, but if you could explain a little bit, if you know anything about that and that quarantine and kind of bring us up to date. Thank you.
Dr. Hazel.
Senator Craig, Senator Ide. The quarantine issues, and I'm not sure if you're talking about something that's recent as of right now or within the last year, but within the last year, they did have some issues related to strangles and influenza. That is really common. It's very, very common when you put horses together in a holding facility to have issues with strangles and influenza. And we do collaborate with them, collaborate with their veterinarian there, but they have a local veterinarian as well as the veterinarian that works with the BLM horse population. The issues they had were regarding influenza and transmission of influenza and strangles. They did everything correct that they could do. But when you have naive horses commingled in a population of that nature, to prevent spread of the disease is very, very difficult. Sometimes by putting those horses through the chute to vaccinate and commingling them in that method, you're almost creating more stress than you are to let the disease run its course, depending upon the risk analysis. I know that they were trying to get the horses that had recovered from clinical disease out of there as quickly as possible. And that was something that they had contacted us about to see if we would allow those horses to leave that facility if they were clinically free, which we did. And they wanted to get the clean ones out of there. So they are working on methods and a protocol to make sure that they don't have that happen again. But it's a very, very difficult situation to manage, and we do work with them on those issues.
Representative Davis, did you have some questions?
Mr. Chairman, maybe I missed it, but could you tell me where we are in the rollout of House Bill 180, the communications, testing and notification requirements?
Representative Crago and Representative Davis, Chairman Crago, Chairman Crago, Representative Davis. So we were given 1 year, I believe, 1 year to go ahead and follow through with the actual final protocol of that bill. There are different methods and different avenues of communication that we are currently working with to see which is the most effective for our producers. So we have several thoughts in mind. We haven't put out a formal written policy on that yet, but it's in progress at the moment.
Follow up.
So you're currently in the rule making process on that. Is that correct then? Is that what you're talking about there?
Dr. Hazel.
Representative Crago and Representative Davis, Chairman Crago, I'm sorry. So from what I understand, that goes into our protocol and put into our rules. I don't think we have anything more formal than putting it into our rules, is my understanding. And in fact, I think it's just a protocol that we can refer to, not necessarily a rule in itself, but it's a protocol for us to follow.
Director.
Mr. Chair, Chairman Crago, Representative Davis, excuse me. Dr. Hazel's correct. It's a protocol that we are driven to develop, not in rule, because the statutes are pretty limiting in how we can do that protocol anyway. So it's determine a protocol to discuss this and work with the producers in the event. I think we've found a pretty good model recently with the meeting in Green River. I think when there's a flicker of interest or there is an incident, I think we can gain a lot of input and a lot of attention from the producers in that area. And to some of the board's determination is that a good portion of the problem is that folks just didn't know what to expect if that happens in their area. And so that is one of our main focuses now, is to get around and educate, but particularly to go immediately to an area where there's an event or an incident, so that people don't have time to speculate and develop their own answers as to what needs to happen, but to visit with them face to face on where we need to go and explain to them the limitations that actually their practicing veterinarian is under and to who he can notify. You know, they're under some similar regulations to HIPAA as your physician is, about how they can disseminate information about a particular person's disease issue. So we're working with that, and that was a good conversation we had in Green River. And in FYI, I guess, when the meeting was over, our 3 veterinarians and the 4 veterinarians in the room closed the college down because they were there till the security guard wanted to go home, having more discussions about how to work that through that chain and then down to the producer. So it's an ongoing process, but I don't think that the statute requires a rule, but to us to have a driven protocol in how we do that. And I would say that the rule would have to be very wide ranging, because that protocol is going to depend on the variabilities of each and every incident as well, and the area where it may happen. I hope that answers your question.
Dr. Hazel.
Chairman Crago, just to add to that, and part of the reason it needs to be so, the ability to fluctuate is that with different modalities of communication that are currently being developed, for example, Gov Delivery just came about, that we can blast an email to a specific group of people, or different methods of Zoom, or all the new communication protocols that we have out there. by putting something specific in writing, it does limit us to what we can do without versus just a guideline to follow. And we don't want to be able to limit ourselves. We want to keep it wide open for anything that new that might be developed with communication protocols. There are some producers that it's very difficult to reach. And listening to the game and fish conversation, we have a lot of hobby people moving into our state. And to reach that group is really, really difficult because they're not members of organizations. They don't attend meetings. They're not in stock growers. They don't read those papers. And so you have to find all these new avenues of communication or avenues that have yet to be developed.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Davis, just to say that at this point, I don't think a rule is required does not mean that the board hasn't determined that that's where they want to put that yet. They may well want to put a wider framework in rule, but they have not made that determination at this point, as we're still investigating the best avenues that'll affect the most people. If it needs to be really wide, maybe just a policy protocol that's established and scattered amongst all practicing veterinarians, producer groups, and through the gov delivery or public meeting system may be sufficient. But the board is looking at that, putting that into rule, but sometimes a rule is defining a statute. And we want to be able to communicate in each event in the proper manner and still stay within our confidentiality levels that are in 11-18-117 and 11-19-106.
Follow up, Representative Davis.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Chairman, I think the intent is to have something that we definitely can follow and down and do that, that all the veterinarians, so it's not up to an interpretation of the rule. So I think we need to be a little more definite in our approach to this and get a timeline down so that we can see this implemented.
Chairman Crago, Representative Davis, we're still working on that. We're just trying to narrow it down without making it too narrow. Because the protocol that's originally in statute follows several different things. It follows that ability to market outside, as we've discussed during the session and all of that. So we have to be able to protect each confidentiality level, but still notify the people who need to know. And in some cases, it will be just as if your personal medical issue is not my business to know. And if you're not the person or the contact herd, maybe it's not your business to know. That's the process we have to go through. It's one of the questions we get in these groups is a producer saying, I need to know. Trust us. If you needed to know, you would have heard from either the state vet's office or your practicing veterinarian. Otherwise, conduct your business as per normal until you hear something different. That's the case.
So Director, Dr. Hazel, maybe you could, I think what might be helpful for the committee and the legislature as a whole is maybe to have an idea of where we are today. Maybe you could send us an email to that effect, and B, what's your timeline? When do we think we'll have a final result from the work that the department's doing? I think that might put everybody's mind at ease a little bit so that we would maybe know some of those deadlines. So if we want to participate in that process as allowable, we could. I think that might also be helpful too. So sort of wrap that topic up. I think that would be helpful.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I appreciate that. I would say this, we have tentatively right now have a board meeting scheduled November 22nd, I think the 22nd, and that'll be on the agenda to see if the board's ready to nail it down as a protocol or a rule at that time. And then we'll have verbiage after that.
Any other questions on this particular topic? All right, if not, do either of you have additional items you'd like to brief us on? So at this time, I think I'll have LSO talk to us about 24 LSO 0175. And I think we're going to divide these two bills out for purposes of discussion. And just because I think they're in different places as far as being ready to move forward.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Anna Johnson, LSO. This bill draft is 24 LSO 175 entitled Animal Reimbursement Program Account Amendments. This bill draft raises the cap for the amount paid for any single quarantine effort from $25,000 to $50,000. It also raises the corpus of the animal reimbursement program account to 1.5 million. And then this bill draft has an effective date of July 1st, 2024. And I would stand for any questions.
Any questions for Ms. Johnson? Representative Conrad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question. I apologize in advance. Are we exceeding normally the 25,000 that has been allocated previously, thus the change to 50,000? And what's generating the change from 25 to 50?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, I think I would defer that question.
Director.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Red, the question came to us after and during session last year about would that mitigation reimbursement be high enough? At this time, we have had no claims at that level, at the 25,000 level. We have paid out one claim so far. We have the quarantines that Dr. Hazel mentioned too. They may claim under that criteria. But the question that came from one of your counterparts was, with this past winter, could exposures be higher and cause more trouble for the producer to stay within his business model under that mitigation remedy? Our answer was, we don't know. It very well could. If there's a trouble with hay, trouble with grass, too much freight, if they have to move too many cattle around to keep them, they very well could. So we were asked what was a fair increase. We said it's 25 now, maybe 50 would be fair as an increase on the mitigation reimbursement. Now, the other part of that same indemnity account, remember, is only that pays for disposal of animals that are reactor animals. So there's two indemnities within that one fund. If the mitigation reimbursement was to be raised, likely the corpus of the account would need to be raised. That's not an ongoing appropriation. It was a one-time account establishment of $500,000, retains interest and carries over. Today it is at 572 is the balance of that account. But in today's cattle market, it wouldn't take too big of a wreck to bleed that dry in an indemnity basis and or a mitigation in a big outbreak. So that just to point out, Mr. Chairman, that those are numbers we were asked to provide. That is strictly your call, legislative call, and a legislative decision. We just manage that account and pay the indemnities as they arise.
Follow up. Mr. Chairman, thank you. So a clarifying question then. So there has been no claims thus far that have ever exceeded the $25,000. We're betting on the come, for lack of a better word, for $50,000 to make sure we're covered. Is that fair to say?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, yeah, today, up to today, that's fair to say. But again, the mitigation reimbursement quarantine's only been available for 2 years. So that's a brand new piece in addition to the statute. And this statute was built in the time when depopulation was the answer of a herd. And then over time that has become the disposal of reactors. So it's a 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. We're not likely to have to depopulate a herd for the whole 500,000, but we might have 40 reactors we have to pay a disposal for, and he may have to hold the herd that came out of separate and outside of his business model for a period of time that could exceed the 25,000. Is the potential.
Dr. Hazel.
Chairman Craig, just to give an example of what the situation might occur that we faced recently. Whenever we have a herd under quarantine, they're not legally allowed to go to public grazing. In other words, no BLM or U.S. Forest Service ground is allowed for a herd under quarantine. We have a herd under quarantine right now that's over 450 head. They were not going to be allowed to go to BLM grazing or U.S. Forest Service grazing. And had we not been able to make some arrangements, they would have been forced to find alternative grazing for this entire spring and summer. That expense alone, as you can imagine, could very easily have been over $25,000.
Any additional questions on the bill for either Ms. Johnson, the director, or our state vet? All right, so just so we can move these two things along separately, I think we'll take some public comment on this particular bill, and then we'll work the bill if anybody wants to, and then we'll come back and the other bill draft related to the Department of the Livestock Board, I should say. Do we have any public comment on this particular bill? I saw two thumbs, actually, yeah, from the same guy. I don't know if that counts as one or two, but
What?
all right. So seeing no public comment, is there a desire by the committee to take any action on this bill? Senator Larson.
I'll move that we bring this bill forward.
Seconded by Representative Alaman. Is there any discussion on the bill? Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Close enough to make this mic work. I'm not going to vote for this, and I'll tell you why. It's because there's been no factual information brought forward that we're approaching or need to raise this cap. And I think until that happens, I can't justify that as a reason to support a bill. On the, we all can make up a scenario where you exceeded the amount of money you have. I understand that. And I respect the people that have the position they want to fund this, but I can't do it because I haven't seen the need. It hasn't been proven, haven't gotten close. So I don't know why we just need to throw more money at it to raise this cap. So anyway, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Slagle.
Yeah, I would vote in favor of this. The reason I would say that is because it's the state Game and Fish that has the elk that are most likely causing the problems in our livestock herds. And so in a way, I see the state as being responsible for this. So if we're quarantining animals, not allowing them to go on BLM or state land where the diseases may have come from, I think we should be responsible for helping reimburse if they can't go somewhere else for the alternatives they have to see. Be my opinion.
Senator French.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. What's been the largest claim? I'm like Senator Kolb. I'm really torn here to increase something that may not be necessary for a few more years or whatever. What's been the largest claim to date? And if you stated that, I apologize.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Frantz, to this point, the only mitigation reimbursement claim has been at just under 7,000. As I said, there could be some coming on the quarantines we're under now, but we haven't seen them yet. They have 30 days within the end of the quarantine to make that claim.
Senator Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, just a real quick technical question, but it's my understanding now that we can delineate brucellosis from elk from cattle. Is that correct? In other words, source tracking of the the source of the infection. Is that correct or not?
Dr. Hazel.
Chairman Craig, Senator Hicks, that is a correct statement. Through DNA, we can determine. That is not 100% guaranteed that we're able to do that with the samples that we have. When we are able to do that, when it does culture positive, we can do that, but often takes 6 weeks or longer to do so.
So, Mr. Chairman, so if we were inclined to do something that was directly attributed to the state's ownership of wildlife, would be certainly different than if it was just a herd health management issue or bringing livestock into the state that commingled. So if we were going to do that, I don't want to say that all brucellosis is a result of elk. It may very well be all the cases that we've experienced today. But I think we just would be careful that we distinguish that and not make that assumption.
Thank you, Senator. Any other discussion on the bill? Senator Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I think this is a good bill. I think we need to help protect our ranchers. I mean, if it is coming from our state wildlife, and it isn't something they caused, I think it's a good idea. Our state vet gave a good example of how we could have recently been above the 25,000. So I'd encourage you and I vote.
Senator Ide.
Mr. Chairman. So I'm a little bit on the fence here on this as well. Good comments by everyone. If we did raise it to 50,000, what happens if we go over it then? Or why don't we, I mean, should we go to 100,000 or should we go back to 10? We've only, the maximum we've had is $7,000, it sounds like. So I don't know. I guess I don't understand, like Senator Kolb mentioned, how we pick, a number of 50,000 that's double from 25 when we've only had a claim to 25. We're speculating on the future. And I don't like to do that in this case. So probably no vote on that. Thank you.
Representative Davis.
Mr. Chairman, could you go over the quarantine procedure for us? Is it, if you've got 450 animals, are they all quarantined, no movement? Do you go through and test them? Is there a certain incubation time? I guess just want to be perfectly clear on that.
Dr. Hazel.
Chairman Craig, Representative Davis, certainly. So typically what they have to go through is 3 whole herd negative tests. That takes approximately 1 to 1.5 years to complete that testing protocol. Quite often those herds are found in the fall, but not always, as one of our herds currently was not. That means that those tests have to be a minimum of 60 days apart, with one of those tests 45 to 60 days post-calving throughout the year. So typically a year to 1.5 years. During that time period, all sexually intact animals are under quarantine. They cannot move without being tested. For example, if the heifers were typically sold as replacement heifers, that most likely will not be allowed. It most likely will end up going to a designated feed yard. Those females can only go to what's considered a designated feed yard, or a feed yard that is registered with the state to be a terminal feed yard. There are those exist typically in Idaho, Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana, as a rule, a few in Nebraska, but they're restricted onto where they can go as far as feeding purposes. Those cows, if they are sold, can only go direct to slaughter. They can't be sold as bred cows per se, without a lot of testing and some exceptions to the rule. They cannot go on public grazing land at the time that they are quarantined. So no BLM, no U.S. Forest Service. Anytime something does need to be tested, there's a series of tests that we can run. If they're quarantined for a certain period of time, we run multiple tests. They're not an adult cow. We can maybe ship them as a breeding animal, but typically they all have to be sold as cull animals if they're a female that's intact. So it's quite an extensive quarantine. Also, they cannot commingle with any other herds, which prohibits that public grazing that they may have had. And nothing can be sold as a breeding animal. So if you have a herd that's a registered herd or a breeding herd, it's a very serious expense. Correct.
Representative Alaman.
I encourage a yes vote on this bill. I think it's a good bill also. It's not money that we're spending or throwing away, but we're going to protect some ranchers maybe someday. Let's hope not. Let's hope we never spend it. But I would like to see it there if we need it. Thank you.
Any additional comment? Dr. Hazel.
Chairman Craig, just to add to that, whenever you have a herd that does keeps their calves for replacement heifers, for example, the herd cannot be negative until those replacement heifers have grown, are bred and calve. So that's another, at least a 2.5 year quarantine that they'll be under as well.
All right, with no additional comment. Nope. Senator Ide.
Mr. Chairman, just real quick, what does happen if we leave it at 25 or we go to 50 and we have $100,000 claim? What happens at that point? Does anybody have an answer to that? Thank you.
Director.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide, if you leave it at 25, that's the maximum amount one producer can claim. And, and just a side comment, and again, we don't have skin in this game. We just administer the account. If the mitigation indemnity goes forward at $50,000, it's important to note there's $100,000 floor in that account, that once the balance reaches 100,000, there are no more mitigation claims paid. Because this is a one-time, it's not a standard appropriation. This is a one-time funding. So it's important to note that if the 50,000 went up and the corpus did not, the likelihood of burning the account is higher. So that's why there was an ask of us if we had to do throw some numbers out there, and that's what we did. We just threw a number to increase the corpus to, and a number for the mitigation, then the corpus could stand that if there were claims at that level. Just a little FYI, sir. Thank you.
Any additional comment? All right, seeing none, in order for the committee to sponsor the bill at our upcoming session, we have to engage in a roll call vote. Katie, please call the roll.
Mr. Chairman, this is roll call for 24 LSO 0175.
Katie. We have one more comment or question or something.
Mr. Chairman, just a clarification, and I don't remember what rules the committee adopted at the beginning. Does it take a majority of the committee or majority of both houses to sponsor legislation? Yeah, maybe LSO
Senator,
staff would have that.
If I remember correctly, and we can double check with them, Senator, but I think it's a majority of each individual house.
Is that correct? All right, thank you.
Sorry, Katie.
This is roll call for 24 LSO 0175 Animal Reimbursement Program Account Amendments. Senator French.
No.
Senator Hicks. Senator Ide.
No.
Senator Kolb.
No.
Senator Larson.
Aye.
Representative Allemand.
Aye.
Representative Allred.
Aye.
Representative Banks.
Aye.
Representative Conrad.
No.
Representative Davis.
No.
Representative Eklund.
Excused.
Representative Slagle.
Aye.
Representative Winter.
Aye.
Co-Chairman Steinmetz. No. Co-Chairman Crago.
Aye.
Senate, there's 4 no, 1 aye. In the House, there are 6 aye, 3 no, 1 excused.
Based on that vote, the committee has declined to forward that bill to sponsor that bill for the next session. I think we'll get into the next topic. I don't know if we'll get it finished by lunch, but if Ms. Johnson could come present 24 LSO 0127 for the committee, please.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this is 24 LSO 127 entitled Meat Processing Plants, Hides and Carcasses. This bill draft requires every establishment engaged in slaughtering or processing cattle to keep the unmutilated hide or a written record of the unmutilated hide together with a pre-slaughter brand inspection certificate for the animal. The written record can be a copy of the bill of sale or a disposal form provided by the Livestock Board. The records shall be available for inspection for 2 years from the date of slaughter or disposition. If a hide is sold to a hide buyer, the hide or bill of sale shall be inspected by a brand inspector. The person presenting the hide shall pay the inspection fee for each hide inspected. On page 3, the amendments to 1123-104 indicate that any person who kills his own cattle for beef must present the hide of the animal or a certificate of inspection of the hide upon request. On page 4, the amendment to 1123-202 indicates that a bill of sale must be provided to a hide buyer. 1 copy shall be retained by the seller, 1 copy shall be retained by the slaughterhouse or meat processing plant, and 1 copy shall be retained by the hide buyer. The amendment to 1123-203 indicates that a hide buyer must keep a true record of all hides and pelts purchased by him for not less than 2 years from the date of purchase. In section 2, Wyoming statute 1123-101 is repealed, and that language is contained in the staff comment in the bill. And then section 3 provides an effective date of July 1st, 2024. And I would stand for any questions.
Any questions from the committee for Ms. Johnson? Co-Chairman Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have a question. I just have a comment because we've been working on this bill. It came up and I'll let Director True talk about how this all started at the appropriate time, but this bill is not ready for prime time. We can look at it today. We can have a discussion today, but I think we've actually exacerbated the problem a little bit more than what we started out with. And so this came about because of some folks that were actually trying to utilize the hides from carcasses. As we know, most of the hides are being disposed of now. We don't have a real hide market in the state of Wyoming, and we were actually trying to help those folks because there was some confusion about how things work as we modernize the system, right? The hides used to be basically the only identifier we have, and now when we go through a slaughtering facility or some other process, there are a lot of other things that have come into play. So just for the committee's edification, this bill needs a lot of work. I don't think it's something that I would like to see us forward today, but I do think we need to have a discussion about what we're trying to do and why, because it came up in between committee meetings. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. So what might be helpful, Director, is if you would give us your walkthrough of the bill and sort of what the language is going to do and why it's necessary or not necessary in your opinion, and how the department's going to use that. Thank you, Ms. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quickly, the genesis of the bill, as the good co-chair said, is hides are not kept for inspection anymore. And the original statute 1123-101 says that any person has to produce the hide in order to have the sale of the beef or the slaughter of the beef. So we've got 2 things required in statute that can't happen anymore. Number 1 is we're required to inspect a hide that's not available. So we can't perform our part of the statute, and the producers can't keep that hide because they don't have a hide market to sell it into. So the chairman and I, co-chairman and I have spoken about, so how do we fix that? Because I still have a constitutional and statutory mandate to protect producers from theft. So I need something that says how the hide was disposed of. I think we may have a little too much language here in how we do that, and I'm not sure how we clean that up. But I want to make it as easy as possible for the custom slaughter folks, but us still to be able, in the case of a question, to have records produced, at least to have the disposal of the hide, and that matches with the timing of the pre-slaughter inspection on that. And I'm not sure just how to juggle that in easy, quick language at this point. I would only say for the committee's viewpoint, one of our brother brand inspection states to the south of us had a case of a custom slaughter person that was taking advantage of a non-hide inspection statute and was gathering some occasional cattle, killing them and sending the meat outside in another market. So I just want to be able to say that I know our custom slaughter folks are all above board, but who's to say 20 years from now that we have one that isn't? So rather than reinventing the wheel and how we are able to investigate that and require them to produce either the hide, if they sell a hide, or records of disposal of the hide. That's our main goal, is to do one of those two things. The co-chairman and I spoke. Most hides go into a truck or a pit immediately. And so there is not an opportunity to look at them without having an inspector on site every day, which isn't going to happen. So we still need to be able to do that. Plus there is the occasional pretty longhorn hide that comes through that somebody wants. So we already have hide buyer statutes in the back. And so we want to use that to handle that one-off case when there's somebody wants to buy a hide, and then we can maintain the same hide inspection statute at that time, which also covers the statute in case hide would resurrect at some time. No, it's been cyclical when hides can be when they're valuable, and though not valuable at this time, who's to say that they won't be again in the future and our hide inspections will again become prevalent. So there's several things we need to balance there, and I agree with the co-chairman that we don't have the language right yet. So having said that, I would leave it to the committee to deem how you want to move forward with that.
Any questions for the director? So I have a couple, just to kind of help as if we want to look at this bill going forward. I mean, is there a necessity, as the bill's written now, for example, it's going to require, the language in there requires a double inspection, right? Pre-slaughter and then prior to the sale of the hide. I mean, if you're inspecting the hide pre-slaughter, you don't need to look at it. The inspectors surely don't need to look at it 2 days later when it gets on a truck to go to wherever. And is that a fair statement?
Yes and no, Mr. Chairman. There's two different things there. The pre-slaughter inspection is to make sure the ownership of the animal that goes to slaughter belongs to the person sending them. Technically, in the way the old statutes are written, the hide still belongs to that producer. So that's when the hide inspection comes through. So to give you 100 years ago, when I was a brand inspector, and for the public, I'm exaggerating the 100 years, but so once a month, I went to our slaughterhouse in Laramie County. He would pull a pallet of hides out of his cold box because the hide buyer was there. I'd collect all the bill of sales where, for example, you signed the bill of sale for the hide over to him. That was the bill of sale for the hide, not for the animal. Now the proof of ownership inspection is for the animal to make sure you're butchering the right animal. That's why we still ask for the hide bill of sale in the hide buyer statutes. That bill of sale would be issued through the slaughterhouse from the owner of the hide to the purchaser of the hide. That's the way we see that tracking. If the committee finds another way to track that, I'm not predisposed to be against that. But the way I would look at it now, if I was the slaughter person, Dr. Hazel brought the animal and she's the owner of the hide. It's a real pretty blue roan hide. I say, I know somebody that's going to want that. She can sign a bill of sale for that hide the day she delivers the animal to the slaughterhouse. Then that can be issued with the slaughter or the hide inspection with that hide. Does that make sense to the committee? That's separate from the pre-slaughter inspection of the live animal.
Well, here's what I'd say, Director. It makes sense on paper. In practicality, I'm not sure it does. I mean, and how things actually work when us producers haul stuff to the facilities, I'm not sure it makes a whole lot of sense. And it seems like we're gumming up the system, and I think the bill draft probably, as the good co-chairman said, makes it worse, not better. And so obviously we need to work on that language. I'm just curious if there's a way, and I know there's some more questions coming down here, but if there's a way we can do it through paperwork and record keeping rather than actual inspections, right? So the state can retain the right to inspect somebody's records if they're suspecting something is happening or if there's something nefarious going on. Sure, we have a statute that says, hey, you have to keep those records. And if you don't, you can get in trouble. take the inspection out of it and do it on a as needed basis, you know, on the hides. I understand we don't want to do that on the live animals, but on the hides, it seems like there's something in there somewhere in between the two positions that might still give us the ability to do what we want to do, but not require all of this extra administrative work on behalf of not only the people in the plants, but on the state. Is that something we could look at?
Mr. Chairman, that's fair. And that's one of the places we want to get to, but we haven't been able to because of, to us, the way we read the two inspections. Hide inspection is one, animal inspection is the other. So we were hoping through that disposal notice of the hide that we know that either you threw it in the truck or you're going to sell this one. And then if you sell this one, then the bill of sale needs to be provided. That's the short story of how we wanted to get there. This isn't the short version of getting there. I agree, Mr. Chairman. So I think keeping that in mind and keeping the hide inspections available in the event that that market comes back, I think is vital. There's no sense for you to reinvent that wheel 5 years from now if that market returns.
Senator Kolb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Listening to this conversation, I'm a bit baffled, and I'll just say something that bureaucracy doesn't like to die. And we got an issue here with ownership or pre-slaughter inspections, which obviously you made a compelling argument that we need to keep those. However, the hide inspection after the said animal is slaughtered, I'm baffled by this because tell me why that wouldn't be a civil issue. Say if I'm a person who brought my animal in and I wanted to retain ownership of said hide and didn't have an agreement with the person who slaughtered it, yet they sold it off on me to someone else, right? I don't know why, you know, I know it's something we've done in the past, but it doesn't seem to make any sense to me. And I've heard a lot of reasons why we did what we did in the past and it was justified. But I'm still not convinced that we need to have a second inspection. It seems frankly obvious that the first inspection is necessary. The second one is certainly doesn't seem to be necessary. So I guess maybe I missed the point, but what I've heard is we just want to keep on doing what we're doing because we like it. And I think you do a great job on what you do, but I just think this is one of the areas I don't understand it yet. I guess I'm still listening. Thank you.
Director.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, I don't want to do it the way we used to do it because I'm not climbing in the gut truck to look at that hide. But I would say that either just having that disposal form, I need to know the disposition of the hide that came off of that animal that we inspected. The reason being, and you look into 1120 or 1123-104 about any person who kills his own, that's written for somebody that butchers their own. You have a heifer that breaks a leg and you have the capability of butchering her and grinding her up. You do that. But what if the neighbor says, yeah, Senator Kolb did that, but that was my cow. I need you to produce that hide or a title paper to that animal. So he probably buried it, but we're going to want you to dig it up. So back that up to the slaughterhouse. If there is a question, I need some records to investigate, as the chairman spoke to, and or the hide. I'm not going to see the hide now, so I want to make sure that the paper trail is followed. And again, it's convoluted, but the way, and this is historical, these are 1929, these statutes started in. But the way that it starts is the animal inspection is one and the hide inspection is another required by law. So I still have to maintain within that some ability to determine the disposition of that hide, and does it match the animal that the record was there for.
Follow up, Senator.
Mr. Chairman, 1929. Well, I didn't have cell phones back then, didn't have any way of taking pictures really readily, easily. Is it a possibility that we could add in a change that said we could take a photo of said hide, some way to make it easier? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cole, your good co-chairman had its comment of the same level, and I don't think that's impossible. No, We might want to talk about how that fits in brand inspection law and no electronic facsimiles as a whole. But I don't have a problem. A picture with a hide is a whole lot better than anything else. You know, and if it's attached to a zip drive and my brand inspector can collect that and match those hides to that paperwork once a month, quarterly, I'm happy with that. But there is language in brand inspection in 1120 about no electronic, or maybe it's even 1118 and about no electronic facsimiles allowed. We all know that really happens sometimes out there on the highways. I'll take that brand inspection that the rodeo guy has on his phone, as long as it's the right name and the description matches the horse. I'll believe that he took a picture of his own paper. But our statutes don't openly allow that. So that might be some conversation down the trail. But I think that's a good answer in this loop.
Representative Davis.
Chairman, you brought up something that, caught my attention, where we go from our state to another state to slaughter and what their regulations are on the hides. Are you able to access that hide information from another state, or what's their protocol on this?
Director.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, in the case of an investigation, yes. Whatever they have available, we would go through our counterparts in that state to reach out to that slaughter facility and find out what records were available to inspect. Same, and then that would be reciprocate. If an outside animal came to Wyoming for slaughter, same way.
Senator Ide.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. On top of page 3, person presenting a hide shall pay the inspection fee prescribed by law. Is that an additional fee to what we have right now, or is that status quo? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide, that's status quo. And then hide inspections are $1.85, whether you got 1 or 500. It's not a revenue producer.
Senator French.
Yeah, just for my own information, I guess. Are individuals exempt from all this stuff? If I want to slaughter growing up, our family always slaughtered our own animals. Are individuals exempt?
Director.
Mr. Chairman, Senator French, you are exempt from the pre-slaughter inspection because I'm probably not going to know that you broke a leg and you're going to butcher one. But if an 1123-104 says what investigation can happen if a neighbor raises the question that wasn't Senator French's animal, it was mine. And that's when we can either ask for proof of ownership on the animal or produce the hide if you still got it.
Follow up.
If I steal your cow, probably going to cut the brand off the hide and it'll disappear. So individuals they're probably not going to do that. So essentially they're exempt. Anyway.
Mr. Chairman, if I could comment on that, because butchering is one of 4 common types of cattle theft, livestock theft, between actually stealing your cow, butchering your cow, borrowing your cow and stealing 5 or 6 calves out of her before I give her back, or white collar crime and fraud. So that's common. There was a case this year in southwestern Wyoming where they found the hide and the feet on the side of the road. That happens monthly around the state. So we find a hide, we don't have any meat, but we know that's a cattle theft case. If we could find that, but so that's one of the reasons that some of these are in there. And again, like some of them are antiquated, I get that. Some of the transporting of carcass statutes are pretty antiquated.
Follow up, Senator French.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Co-Chairman. It wasn't me.
Asking for a friend, Senator?
Any other questions for the director or the good doctor? If not, we'll move on to public comment. We might be able to close this topic out before lunch, keeping in mind that I don't believe we're going to move this bill forward at this point, other than to keep working on the bill for our next meeting. So public comment. Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chairman, fellow committee members, once again, thanks for letting me speak. This relates to House Bill 180 and the communication protocol. Just to give you an idea, and just to give you an idea on the cost associated with quarantine. So I'll give you my own example. So we had a hot cow, but it turned out it was just a vaccine glitch. And but when it happened, the state had issued the permit to ship. Our cattle were on the truck at Rock Springs when we got notice that those cattle had to turn around. We ended up eating that trucking cost when normally the guy that buys the animals eats the trucking cost. And because he said he wouldn't take shipment of the animals. So that's an example of a cost associated with this. And I, whether I didn't get up and speak to Bill, whether you leave it at 25 or 50, I don't know that matters. Ultimately, if that gets tested at some point, I think you guys are right. I think what's more important is there enough money in the fund right now. There's 500,000. Appropriations can put more money in if it's a necessity, I think. So I think you guys were all right, but I think you need to understand that, and I think you do, that the state's wildlife have consequences as it relates to brucellosis for producers like us in this area. And that comes with real costs. The whole marketing side, everybody just assumes you have brucellosis now anyway. That's how the market reacts to your cattle. And so now I get back to House Bill 180, and I know I'm standing between you and lunch. It's really important that we have a communication protocol. And I think, I've been thinking about this just as the Livestock Board and the state vet were providing some testimony. What happens in the fall is, anymore, there's a lot of people from this country won't even ship a cow in the spring. Because if we trip the trigger on brucellosis, then we end up quarantining our herd before they go out. So there's a lot of people won't even send a cow out now. We just wait till fall, send the cows out. Because then there's a chance if you trip, you can test immediately, you can test in 60 days, you can test post-calving, and maybe you get to go out on your allotment. Maybe not with those heifers, bred heifers. You probably have to dump that whole age class of heifers down the toilet somewhere. But there can be huge expenses to this. But what's really important in the fall is that producers, not just the individual like me that had that cow, as soon as I knew that, I let every neighbor know, right? I let every neighbor know because they're going to have to likely test because we all run in common. And everybody's testing cows right then. So you think, well, it's easy. You just run your cows back in, right? Well, you just run your cows through the chute and then you got to run them through in another week. That's not much fun. And it becomes harder because cows don't like that second. They got a little memory in their head, particularly when it's that soon. And so I think it's critical that communication happen, frankly, immediately in the neighborhood when they're, regardless of what if a vet can't release that information, that doesn't mean the state vet can't release that information, because I think they can, as long as we say they can, and we have said they can. And it's really important that neighbors know what's going on. And so I thought about this a little bit, and what if we create just a suggestion for you all to think about? So what if you create an opt-in signature or an opt-out signature? So when a producer gets his cows bled, he can just sign and say, hey, I will release these results to the neighbors if it's hot, or whatever, find a way to do it. But there's a real reluctance from these people to my left to communicate with the rest of the people in the neighborhood when you have one of these problems. Now, and a lot of that is because they feel obligated under HIPAA. They're worried about other consequences, but I tell you, the lack of communication has more consequences than communication has consequences. And then the other thing you need to realize is there were two things in this bill, and nobody asked the question, and that's on page 2 of the engrossed act. And that is 11-19-102F, notwithstanding subsection A of this section, the state veterinarian shall provide testing information to the owner of an animal that is tested non-negative for brucellosis not later than 3 days after receipt of the preliminary laboratory results. And what you all didn't ask is how are they going to comply with that? What is their protocol going to be? Because we weren't maybe as explicit as we should be. So what's a preliminary laboratory result? Is that the very first one that comes out of the state vet lab? Is that the first one that comes out of the feds? Is what is that? And I didn't really know. I hadn't thought of that at the time. And so I think it's important for you all to question these eventually, how they're going to handle this. Because what happens, you can't keep a secret in cowboy country, right? We all know it. So somebody gets a hot animal and it gets leaked out a little bit and somebody knows, somebody tells somebody else. And then once in a while, somebody finds out before the actual owner of the cow found out. And that's why this is put in place. 3 days, that's long enough. From the time the state vet lab gets the result that it's a non-negative, within 3 days, the state vet should be notifying the producer that there's a non-negative. That's not a positive, that's a non-negative, but that's an indication to the community, the rest of us, that we're all going to likely have to think about bleeding. And you'll want to bleed at that point. Trust me. You want to, if you're in the midst of this process where you're preg testing cows, you want to get it out of the way. Now, you may have a herd plan like I do every 3 years.
Mr. Chairman. Down here.
Please.
Mr. Chairman. Point of order. I don't know if we're on the current bill we should be discussing or not. That's my question.
So at this point, I'm going to let the speaker continue. I think he's about done. We were talking about House Bill 180, which actually was talked about a little bit ago. You're correct. It's not on the exact same topic, but it might be helpful because I would actually like to know a little bit of that as well. I think what we can do, Senator, is we'll let the speaker finish, but I think that's the director. The director was going to get us an email and talk about House Bill 180, where we are, what the process is. And I think that could be included in that because there's a good nuanced conversation there about what that notice date is and what that applies to and whether or not we can fix that by rule or whether we're going to need to do something statutorily next session, we probably can't do it necessarily as a committee bill at this point because we're probably too far into the interim on that, but it's something, maybe some of us could work on together as on individual bill or whatnot. But I think that's a good point. So if you finish up, Mr. Speaker, that'd be great.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Yeah, I thought we were open for all issues related to state vet. So my apologies, Ms. Senator. And, on the Hyde bill, it's a bad bill right now. Just if you want a testimony on that, that's Senator Larson. Mr. Chairman, I feel like that bill needs some work. And just on that bill, very briefly, every time I go to a packing plant, I sign a bill of sale for my hide. There's a record of it already. I don't know what the problem is. So anyway, I've said what I wanted to say on House Bill 180. I think there needs to be, and what I do appreciate, one last thing, Mr. Chairman, is that they haven't finalized a protocol because nobody from Sublette County, when they came over here, could be here to comment. And likewise today, people couldn't be here because they're all in the hayfield trying to finish haying. So hopefully there will be an opportunity for the community to come back together when they have time, perhaps early November or something. And so I thank them for not finalizing. I'm just wondering where they're going to be at when we come into this latest season in October where we're going to be bleeding cows. So thank you.
All right. Anything else from the committee? Any other public comment on this particular issue? All right, if not, we will recess until 1:30 when we will start up our next set of topics.